Have you ever heard a room go quiet a half second before it should have? Not the quiet after a door closes, the quiet that arrives just ahead of it, the kind that seems to have been waiting on the other side of the wood, listening, and then steps in first. If you have, then you already understand what the people in this hollow understood, and you already understand why a man who had said the same 11 words at the end of every service for 22 years would one day stop at word 9, close his mouth, and never finish the sentence again for the rest of his life. His name was Ellis Tate Renner. He was a preacher, and the words he refused to say were not a curse, not a spell, not anything a man in a book would call forbidden. They were a blessing, the last line of a blessing so ordinary that it had been said over cornbread and coffins alike in that county for 100 years. And in the winter of 1963, in a church at the bottom of a place called Black Branch, Reverend Renner learned what the last line was actually for, and who had been answering it. A word before we go down into it. If this is the kind of case you would want more of, not one, but a dozen, each told slow and told whole, in a voice made for the dark, there is a collection. What the Hollow Keeps. 12 cases out of 12 counties, 4 states, 1879 to 1981. 9 hours of it, start to finish, to sit with on a long night. The link is below in the description and pinned to the top of the comments. And before I go on, tell me where you are watching this from. Put it in the comments. The town, the county, whatever you are willing to give. I want to see how far this one reaches tonight. And if you have not already, hit subscribe. It is free, and it means the next one finds you. Now then, most of what I am about to tell you comes from 3 places, and I want you to know where they are, because it matters later. The first is a set of reel-to-reel tapes recorded in the summer of 1978 by a graduate student in folklore named Marlon D. Pruitt, who drove a borrowed station wagon down out of Morgantown with a woolen sack recorder in the back seat and a list of 41 names. He was collecting hymn variants. That was all. He wanted to know how the old shape note singing had changed as it moved from ridge to ridge. He got what he came for on 19 of those 41 names. And on the 20th, on a hot Tuesday afternoon, in a house with the curtains drawn, he got something else. He got 4 hours and 11 minutes of an old man talking about a church. The second is a church book. A ledger, really. The kind of long, narrow, hard-bound book that country churches kept for baptisms, marriages, deaths, and the counting of the collection plate. This one covers the years 1904 to 1922. It was kept by a man named Cornelius Ott Faircloth, and for the first 6 years it is exactly what you would expect it to be. After that, it is not. The third is a cardboard box. It sat in the basement of a county courthouse annex for a very long time, and it was cataloged, in a clerk's handwriting, as Times Effects Unclaimed Renner E.T. Inside it were 7 things. I will tell you every one of them before we are done. But there is one in particular I want you to remember I mentioned. Because when we get to it, you are going to understand why the whole rest of this happened. It was a small strip of white pine, about 11 inches long, worn dark and smooth in the middle, the way a stair rail goes dark and smooth at the place where every hand for 50 years has taken the same hold. Hold on to that. We will come back to it. Black Branch is not a town and never was. It is a hollow, a long, narrow, steep-sided fold of ground in the southern part of what I am going to call Cawley County, West Virginia, running about 4.5 miles from the mouth to the head, with a creek down the center of it that gives the place its name. The water there runs dark. Not dirty dark. There is a coal seam that comes near the surface about 1.5 miles up, and the branch cuts through it, and the water comes off it the color of strong tea held up to a lamp. On a bright day it looks black in the shade and copper in the sun, and the older people did not swim in it, and did not let their children swim in it. And if you ask them why, they said the water was cold, which was true, and was not the reason. At the widest point, the hollow is maybe 600 feet across from ridgefoot to ridgefoot. At the narrowest, up near the head, a man with long arms can nearly touch both walls of it. The ridges on either side rise about 800 feet, and they are steep enough that, in the winter, from the bottom you get 4 hours and 40 minutes of direct sun in a day. 4 hours and 40 minutes. I want you to sit with that number for a second, because it explains a lot about the people who live there, and almost nothing about what happened to them. Places like that make a certain kind of person. Quiet, patient, early to bed, not superstitious. Exactly, I want to be careful with that word, but attentive. People who lived at the bottom of a place like Black Branch developed a habit of noticing small changes, because small changes were all they were ever going to get. In 1963, there were 19 households in the hollow, 106 people, by the count kept at the store. There was no post office. There was a store at the mouth of the hollow, run by a man named Dellard Cobb, which also served as the mail drop and the place where the school bus turned around. There were 2 roads, the county road that came in along the branch and gave out into gravel at the head, and an older track that went up over the West Ridge and came down 4 miles later in another county entirely, and was not used, and had not been used since before the war, and I will tell you why in a while. And there was a church. It sat about 2 miles up from the mouth, on the only flat ground of any size in the whole hollow, a bench of level land, maybe 2 acres across on the east side of the branch, with the graveyard on the slope behind it. Black Branch Chapel. White clapboard, tin roof, 6 windows, no steeple, a single room, 38 feet by 22, with 14 pews, 7 on each side of a center aisle, and a stove at the back and a pulpit at the front, standing on a raised platform of 3 steps. 3 steps. Remember that too. The chapel had been built in 1871, and it was not the first church on that ground. The first one is part of this story, but not yet. Ellis Tate Renner came to Black Branch in the spring of 1941. He was 21 years old, which is young for a preacher anywhere, and was young even there, and he had not exactly been called so much as handed the job. The man before him, a Reverend Sowash, had died in the pulpit in the January of that year, mid-sermon, in front of 30-some people, and had gone down slow with his hand on the rail, and had said one word on the way down that nobody in the congregation ever agreed on afterward. Some said he said, "Wait." Some said he said, "Wait." One woman said until the end of her life that he said neither, and that what he said was a name. Renner was born in 1920, on the other side of the county, near a place called Pigeon Fork. His father worked timber and then worked mine, and then, after his lungs went, worked nothing, and sat on a porch and got smaller for 11 years. His mother took in washing. Ellis was the 5th of 7 and the only one who took to reading. He got as far as 3 semesters at a small church college in Kentucky before the money ran out, and he came home, and he preached his first sermon in a schoolhouse to 11 people when he was 19, and he was not good at it. He was too quiet. He read too much from paper. But he had a voice that people described over and over in almost the same words, low and even and slow, like water over a flat rock. It was not a voice that stirred people up. It was a voice that settled them down. And in a place at the bottom of a fold of ground where the sun came for 4 hours and 40 minutes a day, a voice that settled people down was worth more than a voice that stirred them up. So when the deacons of Black Branch needed a man, they took the quiet boy from Pigeon Fork. He stayed 22 years. Now, here is the thing I need you to understand about Ellis Renner before anything else happens in this story, because if you do not understand it, the rest of it will look like a man losing his mind, and it was not that. Ellis Renner was, by every account I have, the least dramatic human being in that county. He kept his sermons under 25 minutes because he had timed them and decided that was the outer limit of what a working person could hold. He did not shout. He did not talk about the devil. When a man in the congregation asked him once, in 1954, whether he believed in haints, Renner thought about it and said, "I believe people see things. I do not always believe the things they see are there." That was as far as he ever went publicly on the subject until the winter of 1963. He married Ruth Ann Cobble in 1943. She was from the mouth of the Hollow, the second daughter of a family that kept bees, and she was 2 years older than him, which she brought up whenever it was useful. She played the pump organ at the chapel. She was not a good singer, and she knew it. And here is the detail I want to give you now, early, because you will need it much later, and I would rather you have it long before you need it. Ruth Ann Renner did not sing the last line of a hymn. She sang the whole hymn, every verse. In a thin voice she was embarrassed by, and then on the very last line, every time, she stopped singing and hummed it instead. She had done it since she was a girl. She said she did it because her voice always broke on an ending. Her sister said she did it because their mother had done it. Renner used to say, "This is in the tapes," in the words of a man who heard him say it, that he could stand at the pulpit with his eyes shut and know his wife was in the third pew on the left, because in the last 4 beats of every hymn in the world, there was one voice in that room that quit singing and went to humming. She also tapped her wedding ring against her coffee cup, twice, every time, before the first sip, without knowing she did it. 2 small clicks. He teased her about it for 18 years. She died in the February of 1961. It started as a cold in the 2nd week of January, and it went down into her chest, and it stayed there. And the road out of the hollow was iced over for 9 days in a row, and by the time they got her to the hospital at the county seat, it was pneumonia in both lungs, and she was 51 hours from the end. She was 43 years old. They buried her in the graveyard on the slope behind the chapel, in the 4th row, 7 stones from the east fence. The ground had to be worked with a fire built on it overnight before they could dig, because February in that hollow puts the frost down 18 inches. And Ellis Renner went back to work, because that is what men like that did. He preached the Sunday after the funeral. 23 minutes. Now, the blessing. Every church has one. The words you say at the end, over the heads of the people, when it is done and they are about to stand up and go out into their lives. In most places, it is a line of scripture. In Black Branch, it was something older and something local, and it was not written down anywhere that anybody could find, and every preacher who had ever stood in that room had learned it out loud from the man before him. It went like this: "Go out from here in the quiet. Go out from here in the light that is left. Go by the water, and go by the ridge, and be counted home. And what is not with you, let it come after." 4 lines. 11 words in the last one. And what is not with you, let it come after. Say it out loud once, to yourself, and hear how harmless it sounds. It sounds like grace. It sounds like a promise about the dead, that those you have lost will follow along behind, that nothing is left out, that even the missing are gathered in eventually. That is how the congregation of Black Branch Chapel heard it for 90 years. That is how Ellis Renner heard it when he learned it at 21 years old from a deacon named Press Hackworth, who taught it to him standing in the empty chapel on a Tuesday afternoon, and who made him say it back 4 times, and who corrected him on the 3rd word, and who then said something Renner did not think about again for 22 years. Press Hackworth said, "You say all 4 in the house. Never say the 4th outside of it." And Renner, who was 21, and who was thinking about whether he was going to be able to pay for a stove, said, "Yes, sir," and did not ask why. For 22 years he said all 4 lines every Sunday inside that building, and nothing happened. 144 Sundays, 200, 1,000. Weddings, funerals, 2 floods, a war, the coming of electricity in 1952, the coming of the first television in 1957. Nothing happened. The blessing was said, the people stood up, they went out along the branch to their homes, and the tin roof ticked as it cooled, and that was the whole of it. So what changed? I am going to tell you exactly what changed, and I am going to tell you the date, and you are going to think, at first, that it is much too small a thing to matter. It was the 9th of December, 1963, and what changed is that one man, at the end of a graveside service, standing outside in the cold on the slope behind the chapel with 11 people in front of him, and the dirt not yet on the box, said all 4 lines. Not 3. 4. He said the 4th line outside the house. But before I can tell you what came of that, I have to take you back almost 3 years, to the spring after Ruth Ann died, because the first strange thing did not happen in 1963 at all. It happened in April of 1961, and it happened to a 9-year-old girl named Corrine Slavin, and it was small enough that her mother slapped her for lying about it. Corrine Slavin lived in the 4th house up from the store, and in April of 1961 she was 9 years old and had the job of walking her grandmother's 2 goats up the hollow in the afternoon to a patch of good grazing on the church bench. She did it every day after school. She was not a nervous child. Her mother described her, years later, on Marlon Pruitt's tape, as the one you sent, because she would go. On a Thursday afternoon that April, Corrine came down the hollow at a dead run with 1 goat and no rope, and when they got her calmed enough to talk, she said there had been a man in the graveyard counting the stones. Her mother asked her which man. Corrine said she did not know him. She said he was walking the rows the way you walk rows, when you are hoeing up one and down the next, without hurrying, and that he was touching the top of each stone with the flat of his hand as he passed it, and that his mouth was moving. She said she thought he was a man from the state, come about something. She said she called out to him, "Hey, mister!" and that he stopped. And her mother said, and I quote it as it came off the tape, "Then she started in on the part I did not care for." Corrine said the man turned around, but that he turned around in 2 pieces, that his head came around first, all the way, and then a moment later the rest of him caught up, and she said that when he had finished turning around, he was closer than he had been, though she had not seen him take a step, and that he was not looking at her, he was looking at the goats. And he asked her a question. He asked, "How many is that?" And she said, "2." And he said, "That is right." And then he went back to counting the stones. Corrine ran. One of the goats came with her, and one did not. The one that did not was found the next morning standing in the branch up to its knees in the cold water about 200 yards below the church, in a place where the bank is steep on both sides, and there is no easy way in or out. It would not come up. Corrine's uncle had to go down and carry it, and he said afterward that it was the strangest thing he ever did, because that goat did not fight him, and did not help him, and did not seem to be in the water so much as standing at the bottom of something. Her mother slapped her for saying a stranger had spoken to her, because in that hollow, in 1961, a 9-year-old girl coming home breathless with a story about a man was a thing a mother met with fear first and questioned second, and the story got the fear. That is all it was. Corrine took the slap and did not tell it again for 17 years, until a young man with a tape recorder sat in her mother's kitchen and asked whether anything unusual had ever happened at the church, and Corrine, who was by then 26 and married, and living in Ohio and home for a week, said from the doorway, "Tell him about the counting man. Here is what I want you to notice, and I am going to keep pointing at it as we go, because it is the shape of the whole thing. He did not chase her. He did not threaten her. He asked her a number, and when she gave it, he agreed with her. Now hold that, and come with me to the store." Dellard Cobb kept the store at the mouth of the hollow from 1948 until he closed it in 1974, and by every account he was the closest thing Black Branch had to a public record. He carried the mail up the hollow 3 days a week in a 1953 Ford pickup, the color of a dirty nickel. He knew who was behind on their account and never once said so out loud. He had a ledger of his own, and I have seen photographs of 2 of its pages, and in the back of it, in a section he kept separate from the money, he wrote down what he called the road notes, which were, as far as anyone can tell, simply the things he saw that he could not explain, recorded flatly, with a date, the way a man notes rainfall. There are 11 road notes between 1948 and 1960. In 12 years. 11. There are 34 in 1961 alone. I am not going to give you all of them. I am going to give you 4, because 4 is enough to show you the pattern, and because the pattern is the thing. The first is dated the 19th of May, 1961. It reads, "Went up past chapel 4:10 p.m. Counted 9 crows on the fence wire. Coming back down 4:40, counted 9 crows on the fence wire. Same wire. Not one of them had moved a foot. Wind was blowing hard enough to move a bird." The second is dated the 2nd of July. It reads, "Sim Ratliff says his lantern went low 3 nights, running about the same time, and came back up. Says all 4 of his lamps did it at once. There is no draft can do that." The third is dated the 28th of August, and it is the one that gets under my skin, and I have read it maybe 40 times. It reads, "Walked the church bench with Preacher R, looking for where the fence give out. Coming back we crossed our own tracks in the soft place by the gate. Going up they are ours. Coming back there is a third set beside them going the same way we went. Same size. Longer step. Preacher did not say anything about it, and I did not either. Going the same way. Longer step. You feel that? That is the whole method of this thing in one sentence. It does not follow you. It goes where you went, at its own stride, and gets there having covered the ground in fewer steps than you did." The fourth road note is from the 11th of November, 1961, and it says only, "Preacher R asked me tonight whether the blessing was ever different. I told him I am not the man to ask. I am not." There it is, 8 months after his wife died. That is the first time we know of that Ellis Renner started asking questions about the words he had been saying every Sunday for 20 years. And I want to be honest with you about why he started asking, because the honest reason is sadder than the eerie one. He was not investigating. He was hoping, and what is not with you, let it come after. A man who has just buried his wife hears that line differently than a man who has not. For 20 years, it had been a nice piece of old language. In the winter of 1961, it became, to him, a promise with a mechanism in it, a thing that might actually be times for times something. And Ellis Renner, who by every account was a careful, quiet, unremarkable man with a low voice, began, very slowly, to want to know how it worked. That is how these things always start. Not with a fool, with somebody in pain who is being careful. Now I need to introduce you to a man who was already dying when this story reached him. Press Hackworth was 83 years old in 1962. He had been the senior deacon at Black Branch Chapel since 1934, and he was the man who had taught Renner the blessing back in 1941. He had lived his entire life within 2 miles of the chapel. He had a bad hip, a good mind, and a habit of ending conversations by simply stopping, not saying goodbye, just going quiet and staying that way until you left. In the February of 1962, Press Hackworth had a stroke that took the use of his right side. He lived 9 more months. Renner sat with him most Tuesdays, and on a Tuesday in the March of that year, Renner asked him the question. He asked it the way you ask a thing you have been carrying for 4 months. He said, Press, when you taught me the blessing, you told me never to say the fourth line outside the house. I have kept it, but I would like to know why. According to Press Hackworth's daughter-in-law, who was in the next room with the door open, and who told the story to Marlon Pruitt 16 years later with the recorder running, the old man did not answer for a long time. Then he said, "Shut that door." She shut it. She heard nothing more that day, but she remembered, because you would remember, that when the preacher came out an hour later, he stood in her kitchen for a minute with his hat in his hands and did not seem to know he was standing there. We know some of what was said in that room because Renner wrote it down. Not that night later, much later, in the spring of 1964, when he wrote out the whole account of what happened to him in a spiral notebook that he never showed to a living soul, and that turned up in that cardboard box in the courthouse annex. I will be quoting from that notebook a good deal from here on. It is not a diary. It is a statement. It reads like a man giving evidence at a hearing he knows will never be held. Here is what he wrote about that Tuesday in March. Press told me 3 things, and then said he would not speak of it again. And he did not. Not in the 9 months he had left, though I sat with him near every week. He said, first, the words are not a prayer. He said, a prayer is words going up. He said, this is words going out. He said, the difference matters more than anything I was taught in Kentucky. He said, second, the fourth line is an invitation, and an invitation is only good in the place where you give it. He said, inside the house, the invitation is to God's own dead, and the house holds it, and the roof and the walls and the ground under it were laid for that purpose by men who knew what they were laying. He said, outside the house it is an invitation to whatever is standing in the yard. He said, third, if I ever said the fourth line outside, I was to go home and bar my door and count out loud and not stop counting until the sun came up and not answer to my own name, no matter whose mouth it came out of. He said the counting is the important part. He said it does not like to be counted with. Then he said he would not speak of it again, and he asked me to hand him his tobacco, and I did, and we talked about the roof of the chapel and the price of tin. That is the 3 warnings, delivered in a back bedroom by an 83-year-old man with half his face gone still, to a preacher who did not believe him. And I want to say that plainly, because it is the truth, and it is important. Ellis Renner did not believe him. Not in 1962, Renner wrote 2 years later. I took it the way you take an old man's fears. I nodded, and I let it go by. I have thought since that I did him a disrespect that day that I cannot make right, because he spent something to tell me, and I took it for nothing. Press Hackworth died in the November of 1962. Renner preached his funeral. In the chapel inside the house, with all 4 lines of the blessing, said over the coffin, as they had always been said over every coffin that had ever stood in that room, nothing happened. Because inside is inside. But here is your first real question of the night, and I want you to hold it and turn it over while I take you through the year that follows, because I am not going to answer it for a while. If the blessing had been said over every coffin in that chapel for 90 years, and the 4th line is an invitation, then who, exactly, had been coming in through the door of Black Branch Chapel, once a funeral, for 90 years? And where did they go when the service ended? Sit with that. We will come back to it, and when we do, you are going to think about the graveyard on that slope differently than you do now. Now, 1963, the year started hard. There was a cold snap the 2nd week of January that put 9 inches of snow in the hollow and dropped the temperature to 11 below at the head, which was a record that stood for a long time. The chapel had a coal stove, and it took 2 hours to warm the room. Renner started going up on Saturday nights to light it so the building would be bearable on Sunday morning. That is how he came to be spending nights alone in the chapel which he had not done before in 22 years. He would light the stove around 8, sit with a book while it took, and often, rather than walk the 1.5 miles back down to a cold house with nobody in it, he would lie down on the third pew from the front, on the left side, the pew behind, where Ruth Ann used to sit and sleep there until first light. He wrote about why, and I think it is the most human sentence in the whole notebook. The house I had was a house she was not in. The church was a building she was also not in. But I had spent 20 years being not with her in that building for an hour every Sunday, and my body did not notice her absence there the way it noticed it at my own table. So I slept in the church. I am aware how that sounds. He slept in that church, off and on, from the middle of January to the end of March, 1963. Somewhere in there is when it started paying attention to him. The first thing he noticed was the stove. The chapel stove was a squat cast-iron box at the back of the room, and its damper made a particular sound when the draw changed a low thump, like a man knocking once on a table 2 rooms away. Anybody who spent time in that building knew the sound. What Renner noticed, sometime in the last week of January, was that the stove thumped at regular intervals, and that the intervals were the same length. He timed it, he wrote the numbers down, and the numbers are, to me, the single most unnerving detail in the first half of this account, because there is nothing supernatural about them at all until you understand what he was actually timing. The stove thumped every 4 minutes and 40 seconds. 4 hours and 40 minutes of sun a day at the bottom of that hollow in winter. 4 minutes and 40 seconds between thumps. Now, is that a coincidence? Almost certainly. A stove damper is a piece of iron responding to heat and draft, and if it settles into a rhythm, that rhythm is thermodynamics, not intent. Renner himself wrote that he knew that. He wrote, "I am not a fool, and I know what a stove is." But then he wrote the next sentence. And the next sentence is where 1963 turns. I know what a stove is. I do not know why, on the night of the 2nd of February, it thumped 41 times, and then did not thump again until I said out loud that I had counted them. 41. I want to put that number down in front of you now, and I want you to keep it, because it is going to come back 4 more times before this is over, and the last time it comes back, it is going to mean something that will make the first 3 times worse in retrospect. 41 thumps of a stove damper on the 2nd of February, 1963. He counted them lying on his back on the third pew from the front on the left side, in the dark, with the coal glow showing red through the seams of the iron and nothing else in the room. He had not meant to count them. He wrote that he had been counting the way a man counts a dripping tap, not on purpose, just because the mind will do it. And when the count reached 41 and the stove went quiet, he lay there for what he estimated was 3 or 4 minutes, waiting for the next one. And when it did not come, he said out loud, into the empty room, 41, and the stove thumped. Once. Immediately. And then, he wrote, it did not thump again that night, and I did not sleep. And at first light I opened the damper and found nothing wrong with it, because there was nothing wrong with it. That is the 22nd night of his sleeping in that building. From here on, the account gets crowded. Through February and into March, Renner began writing down small things, not in the notebook, which he did not start until much later, but on the back pages of his sermon file, which also ended up in that cardboard box. 14 entries in 6 weeks. They are short. Most of them are 1 line, and what they have in common, all 14 of them, is that not one of them is frightening on its own. Every one of them is the kind of thing you would tell somebody at a store counter, and both of you would laugh. Feb 9. Snow on the church bench is smooth to the tree line. No deer track, no bird track, no rabbit. 2 feet of snow down 4 days. Nothing has crossed it. Went and looked at the graveyard side. Same, clean as a sheet. Feb 14. Lamps in the chapel went low at 8:40. All 3 at once. Came back up. No draft. Sim Ratliff had this in July, Feb 19. The east window shows the ridge. There are 11 pines on the near crest. I have looked at that ridge from that window 1,000 times in 22 years. Tonight, I counted 11. That is right. But I have the feeling I have always thought there were 12, and I cannot say why I would think that. Feb 26. Snow gone. Ground soft. Walked to the gate and back. Coming back, my own tracks going up are mine. There is a second set alongside going up. Longer step. Dellard saw this in August of 61, and neither of us spoke of it. Mar 3. Preached to 31. Counted twice because I got a different number the first time. Mar 8. Went up at 8 to light the stove. Building was already warm. I am going to stop on that last one, because I think it is the most frightening two-sentence entry in the whole file, and it is frightening precisely because Renner did not think it was. Went up at 8 to light the stove. Building was already warm. That is it. That is all he wrote. A locked, empty, one-room church. A mile and a half from anybody, on the 8th of March. And the man who has the only key walks in with an armload of coal, and the room is warm. He did not write down what he did next. He did not write whether he checked the stove. He did not write whether the stove was cold, which is the question anybody would ask. My best guess, and it is only a guess, is that he did check, and that the stove was cold, and that he chose not to write that part down because there is a kind of noticing that a careful person avoids for as long as they possibly can. You will do a great deal of work not to write a sentence that you cannot unwrite. Here is where I need to slow down and tell you about the tree line, because the tree line is the thing that broke his rationalizing, and it did it in a way that took 3 months. The church bench, the 2 acres of flat ground, is bordered on the uphill side by a graveyard, and above and behind the graveyard, the slope goes up hard into second-growth timber. Oak, hickory, some poplar, a stand of white pine that somebody planted deliberately in the 1890s, and rhododendron thick as a hedge in the wet places. Ordinary Appalachian ridge woods. If you have walked in them, you know what they look like at the edge. They do not have an edge. A woods meets a field the way a coastline meets water. In a mess saplings, briar, sumac, blackberry, a mat of junk growth 20 feet deep that is neither field nor forest. Renner had looked at that tree line every Sunday for 22 years, and in the spring of 1963, it began to come in clean. He wrote it 4 times over 3 months, and I want to give you all 4 in order, because the progression is the point. Mar 22. The briar along the top of the graveyard is thinner than it was. I have not cut it. Nobody has cut it. APR 14. Walked the fence. From the gate to the northeast corner. 110 feet. The woods now start clean. Grass, then trunks. No brush at all. Like a yard. It does not do that on its own. May 2. Clean now from the northeast corner around to behind the Ratliff Row. 240 feet. I got down and looked at the ground where the briar was. There is no cut stem. There is no stub. It is not cut. It is not there. June 9. The whole graveyard side is open ground to the trunks. A man could walk out of that timber and be at the fence in 4 seconds, and there is nothing to slow him. Read that last one again. A man could walk out of that timber and be at the fence in 4 seconds, and there is nothing to slow him. At some point between March and June of 1963, Ellis Renner stopped describing a landscape and started describing an approach, and he was not the only one who saw it. This is important because a lonely widower having a private crisis is one kind of story, and I would not be telling it to you. Dellard Cobb's road notes have it too, in his own flat way. May 30, 63. Church bench is opening up along the top. Briar gone. Cannot say who done it. Preacher says he has not, and I believe him. Fence wire is not new, but the posts are standing straight, straighter than they was, and I helped set them posts in 51, and they were not straight then. The posts were standing straighter than when they were set. That is the second kind of wrongness in this case, and once you learn to see it, you will see it everywhere in the rest of this story. The first kind is times things that should not be, tracks with a longer stride, a warm building. The second kind is worse, and it is quieter, and it is this: things being made correct. Brush cleared, posts straightened, ground made smooth. Something was tidying that bench. Something was preparing it, and a thing that prepares a place is a thing that intends to use it. Now, here is the question I promised I would leave sitting. If something was clearing the ground around that church, why was it not clearing the ground times inside times it? Because it was not. Not once, not one time in the whole account does anything move, straighten, warm, clean, or arrange a single thing inside that chapel. The building stayed exactly as men had left it, dust where the dust was. The hymnal, with the broken spine in the same rack in the fourth pew, and that will make sense entirely when we get to the church book, which we are getting to soon, because in the July of 1963, Ellis Renner went up into the loft above the vestibule looking for a box of window glass and found something else. But before the loft, there is the matter of the 3rd of June, and I have to tell it, because it is the first night he was afraid. The 3rd of June, 1963, was a Monday. Warm. He had gone up in the evening to mow the church bench with a push mower, because there was a wedding coming on the 15th, the Slavin girl's older sister, as it happens, and the grass on that bench came up fast in June. He mowed until it got too dark to see the line he was cutting, which he put at 8:45. Then he sat down on the chapel steps to cool off. I am going to give you his own words for the rest of it, from the notebook, written a year later. It runs long. I am not going to cut it. I sat on the step maybe 10 minutes. There was still a little light in the sky over the west ridge, the way there is in June, though it was full dark down on the ground. I could hear the branch. I could hear the whippoorwills up the hollow, 3 or 4 of them, going one after another the way they do. Then they stopped. Not all at once. They stopped in order, starting from the far end, coming down toward me. I want to be plain about this. It was not that they went quiet. It was that each one quit as something got to it, and I could hear the quitting travel down the hollow toward the church, the way you can hear a wave of dogs barking travel down a road. The last one was in the poplar behind the graveyard, and it quit. And then I was sitting in the only silence I have ever been in that had a direction to it. I did not move. I have asked myself since why I did not get up and go in the building, since the building was 6 feet behind me and unlocked. And the honest answer is that I did not want to make a noise. That is all. It was not courage, and it was not thinking. I did not want to be the next sound. After a while I will say 2 minutes, and I know I am guessing something came out of the timber above the graveyard and walked down through the stones. I could not see it. It was full dark up there under the trees, and my eyes were no good from the light in the sky. But the graveyard slope is dry ground with old leaf mat under the grass, and a thing walking on it makes a sound, and I heard the sound come down through the rows. It came down through the rows in order, not straight down the slope. It went along the top row, and then down and along the second row, and then down and along the third. It was walking the rows the way you walk rows when you are hoeing. The way that little Slavin girl said it 2 years ago, and I did not believe her, and God forgive me, I never even asked her about it again. It got to the 4th row. The 4th row is where my wife is, and it stopped. It stopped there a long time, long enough that I started to think it had gone and I had missed it going, and then I heard the sound start again. And it came along the 4th row, 7 stones, and stopped at the end. And then It did not come any further, and the whippoorwills started up again from the far end of the hollow, coming back toward me in the same order they had quit. I sat there until they were all going. Then I got up and I walked down the hollow to my house, and I did not run, and I bolted my door, which I had never once done in that house, and I sat in the kitchen chair with the lamp on until it got light. I did not count. Press told me to count, and I did not, because I did not think of him until 3 days later. In the morning, I went back up. I went to the 4th row, 7 stones from the east fence. The grass at the foot of her stone was pressed flat in a shape about the size of 2 feet standing together, and it was still flat at 9 o'clock in the morning with the dew burned off it, and the grass everywhere else in that row was standing up. That is the 3rd of June, 1963. And now I have to ask you the question I have been building toward for 20 minutes, and I want you to actually try to answer it before I go on, because your answer will tell you what kind of story you think this is. It walked the rows of a graveyard, in order, and it stopped at one particular stone and stood there a long time, and then went away. Was it looking for her, or was it learning her? Hold your answer. You will want to change it twice before the night is out. The days after the 3rd of June are, in Renner's own account, the days he tried hardest to be a reasonable man, and I have a lot of sympathy for him in them. He was 43 years old. He was responsible for the spiritual lives of 106 people. He had buried his wife 2 years before, and he was living alone in a 4-room house at the bottom of a hollow with 4 hours and 40 minutes of winter sun, and he had just spent a night sitting up in a kitchen chair with the door bolted. So he did what a reasonable man does. He looked for a cause. He wrote out a list. It is in the sermon file, on the back of a page of notes for a sermon on the prodigal son, and it is titled, "In His Small, Careful Hand, Explanations." There are 9 of them. I will read you 6. 1. A bear. Bears walk graveyards. Bears do not walk rows. 2. A man from outside would have to come and go up the west track. Nobody has used it since before the war, and it is grown over so bad you could not take a horse up it. 3. Somebody local playing a trick on the preacher. I know every man in this hollow. There is not one of them would do it, and there is not one of them could keep it quiet after. 4. My mind. I have thought about this more than the others. I sleep poorly. I am alone. Grief makes a man hear what he wants. But I did not want to hear a thing standing at my wife's grave, and I did not want to find the grass pressed flat in the morning, and the grass was pressed flat, and Dellard saw it Wednesday and asked me what had been standing there. 5. That it is her. I have thought about this too, and I am ashamed of how long I let myself think it. If it were her, it would come to the house. She never in her life went up to that church except on a Sunday, and she complained about the walk both ways. 6. That it is not her and never was, and it has been going up and down that graveyard, learning her the way a man learns a road he means to travel. He wrote the 6th one, and then he wrote underneath it a single line that is the closest thing to a scream anywhere in his papers. God help me, 6 is the one that fits. Now, on the 15th of June, 1963, Ellis Renner married Doyle Ratliff and Virgie Slavin in Black Branch Chapel in front of 68 people. It was the largest gathering held in that building in 11 years. They had to bring in chairs from the school at the mouth of the hollow. The wedding matters for 2 reasons. The first is small, and it is this. At the end of the ceremony, Renner gave the blessing indoors all 4 lines as he had 1,000 times. And a woman named Alta Kitchen, who was 71 years old and sitting in the back pew nearest the door, said afterward, and she said it to 3 separate people that same afternoon, so we have it clean that when the preacher said the last line, the door of the church, which was standing open on account of the heat, moved, not slammed, not swung. She said it came in about a hand's width. the way a door moves when somebody has taken hold of the edge of it on the other side and is about to come in but has not decided yet. She said she watched it for a good while and it did not move again. The second reason the wedding matters is bigger. 68 people. In a room built for maybe 50. And when Renner stood up at the front of that packed room, he did what he had begun doing in March, which was count the house. And he counted 68. And then he counted again, because it was a wedding, and he was distracted, and he got 69. And he counted a third time and got 68. And he decided he had miscounted the second time, and he began the ceremony. He wrote about it a year later. And here is the part that will keep you up. I have thought about the wedding a great deal. I got 68, 69, 68. I told myself I had miscounted the middle one. It was not until the following spring that it occurred to me to consider the other possibility, which is that all three counts were correct. Sit with that. Somewhere in the middle of a wedding, in a room with 68 people in it, for the length of one count, perhaps 20 seconds, there were 69. And then there were not. Now, why the church? Why did all of this gather itself around one white clapboard building on 2 acres of flat ground? To answer that, I have to take you up into the loft. And to take you up into the loft, I have to tell you about the window glass. The chapel had 6 windows. In the hailstorm of the 29th of June, 1963, and this is in the county paper, so it is one of the few things in this whole account you can go and verify yourself. A line of storms came across that part of the state and dropped hail the size of walnuts for 11 minutes. It broke out 2 panes on the south side of Black Branch Chapel. Renner knew there was spare glass in the loft, because there had always been spare glass in the loft, because the loft above the vestibule was where 70 years of Black Branch Chapel's leftovers had gone to sit. He put a ladder up through the hatch on the 1st of July, 1963, with a lamp, and he went up there, and he did not come down for 4 hours. Here is what was in that loft. 2 crates of window glass, packed in straw, from 1929, 4 broken pews, a roll of tin, a crate of hymnals with water damage, a wooden box of what he described as time stove parts and junk iron, 3 collection plates, a folded canvas that had been the old pulpit cloth, a dead hornet's nest the size of a bushel basket, and, at the back, under the low part of the roof where a man has to go on his knees, a wooden chest with a rope handle on each end. In the chest were the church books. Every country church kept them. Baptisms, marriages, deaths, membership rolls, the count of the collection. Black Branch Chapel had 5 of them, covering 1871 to 1960. The one that mattered was the third, 1904 to 1922, kept by the Reverend Cornelius Ott Faircloth. I need to tell you who Faircloth was, and here is the strange part. Almost nobody in that hollow in 1963 could have told you. He served that church for 18 years. He is not in the graveyard. There is no photograph of him. Renner, who had preached in that room for 22 years, knew his name only from the flyleaf of a book he had never opened. In the county records, Cornelius Ott Faircloth is listed as having been born in 1878 in Rockcastle County, Kentucky, and as having taken the pulpit at Black Branch in the spring of 1904 at the age of 26. He married a woman named Nanny Sowash in 1907. There is no death record for him in that county or in any county touching it. The last official document with his name on it is a receipt for a load of coal delivered to the chapel, dated the 4th of December, 1922. After that, nothing. No burial, no obituary, no estate. A man who ran a church for 18 years and then is simply not in the paperwork anymore. The church book he kept runs to 241 pages. The first 110 pages are what you would expect. Then, in the summer of 1910, The handwriting changes, not the hand, the time's use. He starts writing in the margins, then between the ruled lines. Then, by 1914, he has given up the columns entirely and is simply writing page after page in a book meant for numbers. I have read a transcription of the whole thing. Now, some of it is not usable, a good deal of it is the ordinary business of a small church, and some of it is a man arguing with himself in a way that does not travel well out of its own head. But there are maybe 11 pages that lay the entire thing out, in the plain words of a man who was living it 50 years before Ellis Renner ever heard a stove thump 41 times. And I am going to read you those pages. But not yet, because you need one more thing first, or the pages will land wrong. You need to know what Faircloth found under the floor. Before that, though, let me step outside the story for a moment. If you have made it this far with me, into the first hour of this thing, you already know whether this is your kind of dark. If it is, the collection I mentioned at the start times, What the Hollow Keeps, 12 cases, 9 hours, is the same voice and the same pace, and the link is in the description and pinned in the comments. And do me one favor while you are here. Tell me in the comments what your grandparents' church was like, or the one down the road from you, or the one you drive past and have never been inside. I want to read them. There is something about small country churches at night that people understand without being told, and I would like to know how many of us there are. Now then, back down into it. The Black Branch Chapel of 1963 sat on a stone foundation. That foundation was not built in 1871. It was reused. This is not a secret, and it was not a secret then. The men who built the chapel in 1871 used the foundation stones of an earlier building that had stood on that same bench of flat ground, because good cut stone was worth more than a man's labor, and because the ground had already been leveled. Everybody in the hollow knew there had been an older church there. What almost nobody in 1963 knew, because it had passed out of living memory sometime around the First World War, was that the older church was not on the same footprint. It was 70 yards further up the slope, in what was by 1963 the middle of the graveyard. They moved the stones down. They did not move the building. The building came down some time before 1871, and its foundation is still up there under the 4th, 5th, and 6th rows of graves, and there are stones set into the ground up there that people took for grave markers because they were rectangular and set flush and worn smooth, and which are not grave markers. They are the sill stones of the first church. And in 1912, Cornelius Ott Faircloth dug one of them up. Here is the first of the 11 pages. Faircloth's own hand, the 28th of August, 1912. I am reading it as written, and I want you to hear the difference in the voice. This is not a modern man, and he is not trying to be understood by us. I have done a thing today I cannot undo, and I will set it down plain, in case a man after me has cause to know it. Elmer Cobble opened a grave in the 5th row for his boy that died of the diphtheria, and at 3 foot he struck stone, and he came and got me. I went up with a bar and a lantern, though it was near dark. The stone is dressed on all 4 sides, and it is 9 foot long if it is an inch, and it lies flat. And it is not the top of a vault, for there is nothing under it but clay. It is a sill. There was a house here. Elmer went home and I stayed, and I worked the bar under the end of it, for I wanted to see the underside, and I got it up on its edge and let it fall over, and it fell over. The underside is cut. There is a channel cut down the length of it about 2 fingers wide, and it is not weathered. It is fresh as the day the chisel left it, and it has been face down in the ground since before my grandfather. And in the channel there is writing, and the writing is numbers. I counted them by the lantern, and I will put them here. 41 numbers. Each one is a count. The first is 12, and the last is 41, and they do not run in order, but every one is bigger than the one before it, by some amount, and there is no year with them, and no name with them, and nothing to say what has been counted. 12. Then 19. Then 22. Then 22 again. Then 30. And so on to 41. I put the stone back the way it lay, for I did not want it looked at. My hands were shaking, and I am not a man whose hands shake. That is the first page. Now, before I read you the second, understand what he found, because it is the whole architecture of this thing. A sill stone from a church that was pulled down before 1871, cut on the hidden face, the face that goes down into the dirt, the face nobody will ever see once the building is standing, and cut into that hidden face a running tally, 41 counts, each one larger than the last. What do you count in a church? You count the house. Somebody, for some length of time, in a building that stood on that ground before the Civil War, was recording the attendance not in a book where the congregation might see it, but on the underside of the sill, where it faced the ground. And the count went up. 12, 19, 22, 22, 30, all the way to 41, and then the building came down. Here is the second page. The 9th of September, 1912. 12 days later, I have asked about the old church. There is one living who remembers being told of it, which is old Mother Bramwell at the head, who is 91 or thereabout, and who is clear in her mind on the far things and not on the near. She says the first church was Tabor's church, and that it was there before her people came, which would put it 1820 or before. She says it did not have a preacher out of any college, and that the man who kept it was named Tabor and had come over the mountain from Virginia with nothing. She says the church came down in her mother's time, and she does not say it burned, and she does not say it fell. She says they took it down. I asked her why, and she said, because it got full. I asked her what that meant, and she would not answer me directly. She said only that a house that is built to hold a thing will hold it while there is room, and that when there is no more room the thing does not go away, it waits at the sill. She said her mother's people did not pull that church down out of fear. She said they pulled it down the way you would break a jar you had put something in, when you have decided the thing in the jar should not have a jar. Then she said the part I did not care for. She said, they ought never to have used the stone again. Now stop. Because there is the shape of it, and Faircloth got there in 12 days in 1912, and Renner got there in 50 years and 1 week. They pulled down the first church because it was full. Then, 50 years later, a new generation, who had lost the reason, took the sill stones, the same stones, with the tally cut into their undersides, carried them 70 yards down the slope, and built a second church on them, and started counting again from 0. That is why nothing was ever wrong, times inside, times Black Branch Chapel. That is the answer to the question I left with you an hour ago. Inside was inside. The house held. Whatever the men who cut those stones knew how to do, they had done it right, and the roof and the walls and the ground under it were laid for that purpose, exactly as Press Hackworth told a 21-year-old boy in 1941, in language the boy did not think to ask about. And the fourth line of the blessing, said inside, was the thing that filled it. And what is not with you, let it come after. Every funeral. 90 years. I told you to hold a question, and I am going to give you the answer now. Who had been coming in through that door? And where did they go when the service ended? They did not go anywhere. That was the point. The building was ajar. Now Faircloth. The third page. This one is from the winter of 1913, and here is where he starts doing the thing that got him killed, or got him whatever he got, which is that he starts times testing times it. I have kept the count since October. I set it down in the back of this book each Sunday, and I do not put it in the column with the collection where the deacons look. What I have found is this. The count of the house on a Sunday is the count of the house, but the count at a burying is not. at a burying, in the house, at the giving of the blessing, there is one more in the room than came in the door. I have proved it 4 times. I count them in the door, I count them in the pews, I count them at the door going out, in, and going out. The numbers agree. In the pews at the blessing, there is one over. I have looked for him, and I cannot find him. I have gone down the aisle and looked in every face. They are faces I have known 20 years, and still the count is one over. I do not believe he is standing anywhere in that room. I believe he is in the count. I believe he is in the count. I want to read that line again because I think it is the single best description of this entity that any human being has ever managed, and it came out of a country preacher in a coal county in 1913 with no education past a Bible college. I do not believe he is standing anywhere in that room. I believe he is in the count, not a figure, not a shape in the corner, a discrepancy, a thing that exists in the space between the number you get and the number that is true, and that gets one step closer to being real every time somebody counts and gets the higher number. That is why it asked a 9-year-old girl how many goats she had. That is why it agreed with her. Now the 4th page. And this is the mythology, in his words. And this is as close to an explanation as this account ever gets, and it is not very close, and I think that is correct. The date is the 2nd of March, 1914. I have set out to write what I think it is, and I will do it once and not again. I do not think it is a ghost. A ghost is a person that stayed. This was never a person. I do not think it is the devil, and I have prayed on that, and I am satisfied. I think it is the same as the hollow. I think it is what the ground here does. There is ground that is thick, and there is ground that is thin. In thick ground, a man may dig a well and stand on the bottom of it and be alone. In thin ground, a man may stand on the top of it and not be. Black Branch is thin ground, and it has been thin since before there was a name on it. The Indians did not winter here, and there is not a mound nor a camp in 4 miles, though the bottom land is good. A thin place does not hold anything of its own. It is a place where the counting of the world has come loose. And where the counting has come loose, a thing may stand in the count that has no business standing anywhere. It wants in. Not into the church, into the number of us. It cannot come into the number of us on its own. It must be let in. And the letting in is done by a man's mouth. That is the whole of it, and that is why Tabor's people cut the tally where no eye would find it, for they knew that a count is a door, and they did not want any fool of a later day to read it and say it out loud. And I am the fool of a later day, for I have read it, and God forgive me. I said the numbers out loud in that graveyard by lantern light in August of 1912, all 41 of them, one after the next. There it is. He read them aloud, standing in the 4th, 5th, and 6th rows of a graveyard, over the exposed underside of a 9-foot sillstone, alone, at dusk, in August of 1912. Cornelius Ott Faircloth said 41 numbers out loud. And I told you at the very beginning of this to remember the number 41, and this is the 2nd time, and there are 2 more. The 5th page is short, and it is dated the 11th of April, 1915. It is in the yard now. It is not in the house. The house was made against it, and the house holds. I do not go out after dark. I do not answer to my name. Nanny has took to leaving the lamp burning, and I have not told her why, and she has not asked, which is a kind of mercy in a wife that I did not deserve. I have found one thing that works, and I will set it down for whoever comes after. Count out loud. It cannot abide it. I do not know why, and I will not guess. But a man counting out loud, steady, is a man whose number is settled, and while your number is settled, it cannot get in beside it. The trouble is, you must not stop, and a man must sleep. The 6th page is from 1917, and it is the one about his wife. And I am going to tell you now that this is the ugliest turn in this story, and that it happens again. in 1964 to another man in almost exactly the same way. If you are listening to this in the dark with the volume low, this is the part. Nanny's sister Ollie died in the January, and we buried her out of the church, and I gave the blessing over her as I have given over 40 others. In the March, Nanny began to hear her at the door. I will set down what my wife told me. She said it comes about an hour after full dark. She said it does not knock. She said it says her name once, in Ollie's voice, and then it says the thing Ollie always said when she come to the door of a night, which was, "It is nobody, it is just me." Nanny says it has got it right, except for one thing. She says Ollie never in her life said the whole of it. Ollie always said, "It is nobody, it is just," and then she would already be coming in, and the rest of it would be swallowed up in the door, and the cold, and the getting in. The thing at our door says the whole sentence. It says it clean through to the end every night, the same way, and then it waits. My wife says, and I do not know how she has thought of it so clear, it has learned her out of the middle. It has not got the end of anything. It has not got the end of anything. Stop there. That is the second key to this entire case, and I need to make sure it is in your hands before we go back to 1963, because in about 40 minutes you are going to hear a woman's voice on the far side of a bolted door in the December of that year, and everything is going to depend on whether you remember this. It learns them out of the middle. It gets the voice. It gets the phrase. It gets the habit, the exact thing the person always did, the thing so specific that no imposter could know it. And it gets that thing times whole, perfectly, completely, every time. And that is the flaw. Because living people do not do anything whole. Living people trail off. They get interrupted by the door. They mumble the end. They stop singing on the last line and hum it instead. The thing at the door always finishes. The 7th page, 1919. This is Faircloth working out the rules, and these are the rules Press Hackworth was still passing along to a young preacher 22 years later, worn down by then to 3 sentences in a sick room, the way everything gets worn down, what I have learned and what a man after me should have. 1. Inside the house you are safe, and the house was made so. Do not sleep in it, for that is not what it is for, and a jar is not a bed. 2. The 4th line of the blessing is not a comfort, it is a door, and it is a door that only opens where you are standing when you say it. Inside the house it opens into the house, and the house holds it. Outside the house it opens into wherever you are stood. 3. Do not say a number out loud in the open after dark, and do not agree with a number that is put to you. 4. If it comes, bar the door and count out loud, and do not stop until light. 5. Do not answer to your name, not once. It has your name off the stone, and it has your voice out of the middle of you, but it has not got your answer, and your answer is the last piece it needs. 6. It will use who you loved most, for that is the shortest way in, and the more you grieve, the shorter the way. 6 rules from a man in 1919. Now the 11th and last page of the usable 11. This is the last thing Cornelius Ott Faircloth ever wrote in that book, and it is undated, and it is at the top of an otherwise blank page, and the page after it is blank, and every page after that is blank, all the way to the end of the book. The handwriting on this page is worse than anything before it. It is a fast hand. The transcriber's note says the ink is heavier at the start of the strokes, which is what happens when a man is pressing. Nanny has been gone since Tuesday, and they are dragging the branch below the shoals, but she is not in the branch. I have counted 11 nights, and I am done with counting. A man cannot hold a number against a thing that has all the time there is. It has been saying my name at the door for 2 nights in her voice, and tonight it said it, and I opened my mouth. I did not answer, but I opened my mouth. There is a way to make it let a person go. Mother Bramwell told it me in '93, and I did not write it down, for I did not think I would ever have use of it. It is done at the first church, and not the second, and it wants a count, and the count must be, and that is where the page ends. Mid-word, mid-sentence. The rest of the page is blank. The pen came off the paper in the middle of the phrase, "Times the count must be times," and never went back down, and the man who was holding it does not appear in another record for the rest of recorded time. Ellis Renner sat in that loft on the 1st of July, 1963, with a lamp and a 50-year-old ledger, and read that sentence, and then sat there for 4 hours. Now, a normal man reads that and burns the book. Renner did not burn the book. And I have gone back and forth about why, and I have decided that the answer is in a sentence he wrote in the notebook the following spring, which I find almost unbearable. I understood by the end of that afternoon in the loft that the thing outside my church had been getting a little more real every time somebody in that hollow counted wrong for 90 years. And I understood the other half of it too, which is that if it is made out of counting, then it is not a spirit, and it is not a demon. It is closer to a debt, and a debt can be paid. I did not want to run from it. I wanted to settle it. I wanted it settled because I had 106 people in this hollow, and 40 of them were children, and because in the spring somebody would open a grave in the 5th row and hit that stone again, and it would go on. And I will be honest in this notebook, if nowhere else. There was one more reason. Faircloth wrote that there is a way to make it let a person go. He did not finish the sentence, but he wrote that much, and I had read it. And after that I could not stop thinking about the 4th row, 7 stones from the east fence. There it is. The hook that was in him the whole time, a way to make it let a person go. He had a wife in the ground, and he had just read, in the handwriting of a man 50 years dead, that there was a way to make it let a person go, and the sentence had broken off before it said what the way was. You would have gone looking too. Do not tell yourself you would not have. That is the trap this thing lays, and it does not have to lay it twice. So on the 6th of July, 1963, Ellis Renner walked to the head of the hollow to see the last person alive who might know how the sentence ended. Her name was Verba Lee Hackworth. She was 88 years old. She was Press Hackworth's older sister, and if you did not catch that, catch it now, because it means the deacon who taught Renner the blessing in 1941 had been carrying it as family business, not church business. Verba Lee had never married. She lived alone in a 4-room house with a slate roof at the very head of Black Branch, 200 yards above the last of the fields, where the hollow narrows to about 40 feet, and the branch comes down over a shelf of rock in 3 drops. She kept chickens. She had a garden that people talked about for 30 miles. And she had inherited something she did not want from an aunt named Nanny Sowash Faircloth's cousin No. I need to say this correctly, because it matters and it is easy to garble. Verba Lee's mother's sister was Mother Bramwell's granddaughter. Mother Bramwell is the 91-year-old woman Faircloth interviewed in 1912, so the knowledge in this hollow ran down one thread of one family for at least 140 years, and in 1963 the thread ended in an 88-year-old woman who had never asked for it and could not put it down. Renner had known her his whole adult life. She had been in his church perhaps 12 times in 22 years. He wrote that he had always assumed she was simply not a church-going woman. He found out that afternoon that she had stayed out of that building on purpose. Here is his account of the visit. It is the longest single passage in the notebook, and it is the center of this whole story, and I am going to give it to you nearly whole. She had me sit on the porch, and she did not offer me anything, which for her was a hard thing. So I knew before I opened my mouth that she knew why I had come. I said, "Miss Verba, I have found Faircloth's book," she said. I know it. I have known where that book was since I was a girl of 30. I did not go and get it, because a thing like that ought to be found by the man it is for, or not found at all. I asked her if she would tell me what it is. She sat a while. Then she said, "You are asking the wrong question, and you will keep asking it, because everybody does. You want to know what it is? There is no what. Some ground is thick, and some ground is thin. And on the thin ground, the world is not all the way finished. And what is not finished will finish itself with whatever is to hand. Around here, what has been to hand is us." I asked her then whether it had a name. She said, "It has 41 of them." I said I did not understand. She said, "There are 41 counts cut in that stone. Every one of them is a house that got full. Every time one got full, they pulled the house down, and it went hungry a while. And then somebody built another one. It has been fed 41 times by people that thought they were burying their dead decent." I said, "Then what is the count now?" And she looked at me for a long moment, and she said, "You have been counting your house for 4 months, preacher. What is it?" I told her. 31 on the 3rd of March, 28, 33, 29 through the spring, 68 at the wedding, or 69. She said, "That is not the count. The count is the burials. How many has that church buried since 1871? I did not know. I told her I could get it out of the books. She said, "You could, and I will save you the walk." It is 309, and there is one in the 5th row put in without a service that they did not enter. So it is 310, and the church is not full, and that is the only good news I have got for you. I asked her how she knew the number. She said, "Because my mother knew it, and her aunt knew it, and somebody has known it in this hollow since before there was a road. It is the only thing we do. We count." I want to stop the reading right there for 1 minute, because listen to what she just told him. For 140 years, one family in that hollow had done exactly one job. They kept the true count, not the church's count, the true one. They kept track of how full the jar was, and they had passed that number down, mother to daughter to niece, through the Civil War and 2 influenza epidemics and the coming of the railroad and the mines and the electric light, and they never wrote it down, because writing it down is what got Faircloth. 310, and the church is not full, which means somebody, somewhere back down that line, knew what number times full times is. Keep going. Here is the rest of the porch. I asked her the question I had come to ask. I said, "Faircloth wrote that there is a way to make it let a person go, and he did not finish writing it." She got up and went in the house. She was gone a good while. When she came back, she had a bar of white pine in her hand about 1 foot long, and she gave it to me, and I have got it yet. She said, "That is off the door of the first church. My mother's people took 3 of them when they pulled it down, and there is 1 left, and now you have got it. It is nothing but wood. It will not save you. It is a thing to hold when you are counting, so that your hands have got a job, because I will tell you now that the counting is easy for 10 minutes, and it is the worst work a man ever did after 4 hours. Then she said, "Now I will tell you the rules, and after this I will not speak of it again to you or to anybody, because I am 88 and I have got a garden." She said, 1. Say 3 lines, never 4. Not in the house, not out of it, not over a grave, not over a table, not to yourself. The house is old, and it has held a long time, but it was built out of the wrong stone, and I would not trust it now, and neither did my brother. 2. If it speaks to you in a voice you love, listen to the end of the sentence. It cannot leave a thing unfinished. That is not a weakness in it. That is what it is. A thing that came out of a place where the counting come loose cannot bear an open end, and it will always close the sentence. And no living soul ever born closed every sentence they started. 3. If it gets your name in your own mouth, if you answer to it, it is done. And there is nothing I, nor you, nor God's own church can do. So bar your door and count out loud, and hold that piece of wood, and let it say your name all night long, and you keep your teeth together, I said. And is there a way to make it let a person go? She said, there is. I said, will you tell me? And she said, no. I asked her why not, and I have thought about her answer every day since. She said, because you would use it. That is Verba Lee Hackworth, on the 6th of July, 1963. Because you would use it? She knew exactly what he was. She knew he was a grieving man who had just read that there was a door, and she was old enough and clear-eyed enough to understand that the difference between a man who wants to save his hollow and a man who wants his wife back is not a difference you can see from the outside, and sometimes not from the inside either. She sent him home with a piece of pine off a church that came down before the Civil War, and 3 rules and no answer. And that piece of pine is the object I told you to remember at the very beginning of this. 11 inches of white pine, worn dark and smooth in the middle. It was in the cardboard box in the courthouse annex. It was the second thing in it. By the time it got in that box, the smooth place in the middle was worn 1/4 of an inch deep. Now, the rest of July, all of August, September, October, November, 5 months. And this is the part of the story that nobody ever tells right, so I am going to tell it, because it is the part that made everything after it possible. For 5 months, Ellis Renner did the work. He was not paralyzed, and he was not hysterical. He was a methodical man who had been handed a problem, and he went at it the way a man goes at a leaking roof. And what he did in those 5 months is the reason we know as much as we do. First, he counted the graves, not the burial register, the actual stones, and the sunken places without stones, on his hands and knees in the grass with a pencil. It took him 3 Saturdays. He got 310, which agreed with an 88-year-old woman who had never seen the register. Second, he mapped the first church. He did it with a length of baling wire bent into a probe, pushing it down through the sod in a grid until it struck stone and marking each strike with a stick. It took him from the middle of July to the middle of September. What came out of it, drawn in pencil on the back of a 1959 calendar page, also in the box, is a rectangle 29 feet by 19 feet, oriented not to the compass, but to the branch, sitting under the 4th, 5th, and 6th rows of the graveyard. And there is one more feature on that drawing, and Renner marked it with a small circle and the word times step, because the first church had a door sill on the downhill side, and outside that sill, set into the ground, was a single flat stone, 1 step, not 3, Black Branch Chapel, the second church. The one built in 1871 on stolen stone has a pulpit platform of 3 steps. Renner had climbed those 3 steps at least 1,100 times, and he wrote in the notebook, in September of 1963, 3 steps at the front of the second church. And the first church had 1 step at the door, and that is all the stone there is up there that is worked. And I have measured them, and the 3 steps of my pulpit are the same stone, the same width, the same depth, and one of them has a channel cut in the underside, and I have not lifted it, and I will not. They built the pulpit out of the doorstep. Every Sunday for 92 years, the preacher of Black Branch Chapel had stood on the threshold of the older church and given a blessing whose last line is an invitation in a building whose walls were made to hold whatever came. Third, and this is the one that gets me, he tested the counting. He did it on the 12th of October, 1963, in his own kitchen, in the middle of the afternoon, in full daylight, with the door open and the radio on, because he wanted to know how long a man can actually count out loud before he fails. He got 2 hours and 50 minutes. He wrote, I lost it at 2 hours 50, not from tiredness. I began to hear the numbers as words instead of numbers. And once that happens, the number is no longer a number, and I would say 2040, and then I would not be sure whether I had said it or was about to say it. I would put the outside limit at 3 hours for a rested man in a lit room with nothing at the door. Sundown in December is at 5:19. Sunrise is at 7:40. That is 14 hours and 21 minutes. I cannot count for 14 hours. Faircloth could not either, and he was younger than I am. He said 11 nights, and then he was done. And I believe 11 nights is not 11 whole nights. It is 11 nights of getting through some part of the dark and then losing it and lying there hoping. So the counting is not a defense. It is a delay. I need the end of Faircloth's sentence, and that, right there, is the trap closing. Watch how it works. It is beautiful, in a horrible way. The counting works, so he uses it. Using it teaches him it will not last a whole night. Learning it will not last a whole night makes him need the thing he already wanted for the wrong reason. And so a careful, sane, methodical man walks step by reasonable step toward doing the single most dangerous thing available to him, and every step is justified, and every step is logical, and none of them is the step where he went wrong, because the step where he went wrong was 2 years earlier, when he stood at a graveside and thought times let it come after times and felt something in his chest lift. That is how it takes people. Not with fear, with a reason. Now, the 9th of December, 1963. On the 6th of December, 1963, the stovepipe in Black Branch Chapel let go. It had been a hard, early winter. The temperature had not been above freezing in 11 days. Renner had been running that stove hot, and on the 6th, the section of pipe where it turned to go through the wall, Thimble burned through at a seam and dumped smoke into the room for most of an afternoon before anybody noticed. Nothing burned, but the ceiling and the whitewash and the pews and the hymnals and the pulpit cloth took a coat of creosote smoke, and the building was, in Dellard Cobb's phrase, not fit to sit in. 2 days later, on the 8th, Ottie Slavin died. She was 81 years old. She was the grandmother of that same Corinne Slavin who had run down the hollow with one goat in the April of 1961. She had lived in Black Branch her whole life, and she had been in the third pew on the right side of that church every Sunday since before Ellis Renner was born, and she died in her sleep of nothing in particular, which is the way we would all take it if we were offered the choice. And because the chapel was full of smoke, and because the family did not want to wait for a thaw or haul her down to a funeral home at the county seat, the service was held outside, at the grave, on the slope, in the graveyard. 11 people, on the 9th of December, 1963, at 11 in the morning, in 18-degree weather, with the sun already sliding toward the west ridge. I have the 11 names. I am not going to read them all, but I want you to hear 4, because 4 of them are people you have already met. Dellard Cobb, who kept the store. Corinne Slavin, who was 11 years old by then, and standing at the foot of her grandmother's grave in a coat too big for her. Sim Ratliff, of the 4 Lamps, and the preacher. Verba Lee Hackworth was not there. She had not come out of her house since the 28th of November. Read into that what you like. I read a great deal into it. Here is what Renner wrote about the 9th of December. He wrote it 4 months later, and it is the only place in the entire notebook where his handwriting changes. I want to set this down honest, because there is no use in the other kind. It was cold enough that the men had built a fire the day before to open the ground, and there was still a smell of scorched clay coming up out of it, and the pile of dirt had froze in clods on the outside, and had to be broke with the back of a shovel. I read the 23rd Psalm, and I read the piece from Corinthians, and I said what I say about a person, which for Oddie Slavin was not hard, for she was 81 years old, and had been kind to everybody in that hollow, including me, when I came here, a boy of 21, and did not know how to preach. Then it come to the blessing. I said, go out from here in the quiet. I said, go out from here in the light that is left. I said, go by the water, and go by the ridge, and be counted home. And I stopped. Nobody moved. In this hollow, that blessing has been said 4 lines at every burying for 90 years, and every soul standing there knew it, and knew I had come up one short. Dellard looked at me. He knew what I was doing. I am satisfied to this day that Dellard Cobb knew. Audie's daughter Ivoly was on my left with her hand on the box, and she said, quiet, not unkind, not making a fuss. She said, preacher, say the rest of it. Mommy would want the whole of it. And I said it. And what is not with you? Let it come after. I have wrote it out here so that a man reading this will know exactly what I said and will not have to wonder. Now I am going to put down the thing I have not said to a living person and will not. Evilly asked me. That is true. There were 11 people in that cold, and every one of them expected it, and I could have been a coward and mumbled, and nobody would have said a word to me about it. And I have told myself for 4 months that I said it because a grieving woman asked me to at her mother's grave. But I know what I felt when I opened my mouth. I did not feel like a man being pushed. I felt like a man being let. God forgive me. I felt relief. That is the 9th of December, 1963, at approximately 11:20 in the morning, on the slope behind Black Branch Chapel, in the open air, 7 rows, and about 40 feet from the grave of Ruth Ann Renner. Now, here is what I want you to understand about what happened next, because it is not what people expect, and it is the reason this case sat in a box for so long, instead of becoming a legend. Nothing happened for 6 days. Not a sound, not a track. Nothing at the door, nothing on the ridge, nothing in the graveyard. 6 ordinary December days in a cold hollow. Renner wrote that he got through the 10th and the 11th braced like a man waiting on a diagnosis, and by the 13th he had begun, and he is honest about this, and it is very human, he had begun to be times disappointed. I have to write that I was let down. That is the plain truth of my heart in that week. I had said the words, and there was nothing, and part of me said, good, it is an old story, and an old woman's tale, and a stove is a stove. And another part of me, that I like less, said, it did not work. On the 14th, it started. Not at his house. At the Ratliffs. Sim Ratliff lived a quarter mile below the church on the same side of the branch. He had a wife, Dosha, and 4 children, the youngest a boy of 6 named Estiel. And on the night of the 14th of December, Estiel Ratliff woke his parents at about 9 o'clock in the evening and said there was somebody outside asking him how many. Dosha Ratliff told this to Marlon Pruitt 15 years later, and she told it flat and slow, and you can hear on the tape that she has said it a lot of times to herself and not many times out loud. She said the boy was not frightened. That is what stayed with her. He was annoyed. He said the man outside the window kept asking him how many was in the house, and he had told him 5, and the man kept asking, she said she asked him, and she is very clear about this, she said, Estiel, what did you tell him? And the boy said, I told him 5, but Daddy is not home till Thursday, so it is 4. I told him 4 to be right. She said, did he say anything back? And the boy said, he said that is right. Sim Ratliff was working over at a mine in the next county that week and coming home Thursdays. The boy corrected himself. To be right, because he was a careful child who did not like to give a wrong answer, and a thing standing outside a window in the dark agreed with him. That is the 3rd time in this story that this happens, and every time it is the same exchange. It asks, A person gives a number. It confirms. Now, the 15th of December, and it came to Renner's house. And from here we are in the last part of this, and I am going to slow all the way down, because the next 8 days are the reason there is a story at all. Renner's house was the parsonage. 4 rooms, 1.25 miles down the hollow from the chapel, on the west side of the road with the branch behind it. Kitchen, front room, a bedroom he had stopped sleeping in, and a small back room with a cot in it. 1 door front, 1 door back. 6 windows, coal stove in the kitchen, and by 1952, 1 electric bulb in each room on a pull chain. On the night of the 15th of December, 1963, at approximately 6:40 in the evening, full dark, sundown having been at 5:19, Ellis Renner heard somebody hum 4 notes outside his kitchen window. 4 notes. The last 4 notes of the last line of the hymn, Times There Is a Fountain, which was Ruth Ann Renner's favorite, and which she had played on the pump organ at Black Branch Chapel every Easter for 18 years, and on the last line of which she had always stopped singing and hummed. He wrote, I was at the table. I had a plate in front of me. I heard it, and I did not stand up, and I did not turn around, and I want to be plain that I did not think it was her. Not for 1 second, not 1 part of 1 second, because I had read Faircloth, and I had sat on Verba Lee's porch, and I knew what I had done at that grave 6 days before. What I felt was not hope. I have got to put this right. What I felt was the exact feeling of being handed a thing you asked for and knowing, in the same instant, that you are going to be charged for it. I got up. I put the bar on the front door and the bar on the back door. I had made both of them in October, and I had not used either one. Then I took the piece of pine out of the drawer, and I sat down in the kitchen chair facing the front door, and I began to count out loud, 1, 2, 3, 4. I got to 11,400 and something before the light came. I do not know the exact number because at some point in the night I began counting in hundreds and then went back and started again from a round number, and twice I lost the thread altogether and sat in the quiet, and both times, in that quiet, it hummed. It hummed the same 4 notes. It never once hummed anything else, and at about 4 in the morning it stopped humming and said my name. It said, Ellis. It said it in her voice. Not close to her voice. Her voice, the way it was in the last year, when she had got that little roughness in it from the cold that never quite went. I did not answer. I held that pine, and I counted, and I did not answer. It said my name 11 times between 4 and daylight. I counted those too, because by then I could not stop counting anything. 11. 11 names at the door. 11 nights of counting. In Faircloth's account, 50 years before. And here is the detail that turns the 15th of December from a ghost story into a case, the detail that makes me certain. Whatever you decide this thing was, that something physical was standing outside that house. In the morning, Renner opened the front door, and there were no tracks in the snow. Not no tracks. That is what I would expect. That would be a ghost story. The snow was time smooth. It had been trampled the day before by his own boots going in and out, and by Dellard Cobb bringing the mail. And there had been no new snow. And in the morning it was smooth, level, unmarked. From the door to the road, 60 feet, blank as a made bed. Something had not only walked up to that house without leaving tracks. Something had gone back over the ground and taken away the tracks that were already there. And I told you to watch for the second kind of wrongness. Things being made correct. Briar cleared. Fence posts standing straight. And now the snow between a preacher's door and the road, smoothed over in the night, 60 feet of it without a mark. It was tidying his yard. The way you tidy a room you are about to move into. The 16th of December, it came at 6:50. The 17th at 6:55. The 18th at 7:02. Renner wrote the times down every night, And I want you to notice something about those three numbers, because he noticed it on the 19th, and it frightened him more than the voice did. It was not coming at a fixed time. It was coming later, each night, 5 minutes, 7 minutes. It was coming at the same time's interval after full dark. It was following the sun. And on the 21st of December, the sun sets in that hollow at 5:19 and does not come back for 14 hours and 21 minutes. And that is the longest night of the year. And Ellis Renner, sitting in a kitchen chair with a piece of pine in his hand, was a man who had already measured his own limit at 2 hours and 50 minutes. He had 3 days. Now I want to tell you about the days, because everybody remembers the nights, and nobody remembers that this man still had a life to run. On the 17th of December, he taught the Wednesday children's class at the school at the mouth of the hollow. 14 children. He wrote out the lesson the way he always did. On the 18th, he drove Dosia, Ratliff, and the baby to the clinic at the county seat, 40 minutes each way, because Sim had the truck at the mine. On the 19th, he wrote his Christmas sermon. It survives. It is 4 pages. It is about the census, in Luke. Of course it is. Of course the man wrote his Christmas sermon that week about being counted, and it is the calmest, warmest, most ordinary piece of writing in the whole file. There is not one crack in it. Whatever was happening to him at 7 o'clock at night, at 10 in the morning he was a country preacher writing about a young couple traveling to be registered. I find that harder to read than any of the rest of it. And on the 20th of December, 1963, Ellis Renner went up the slope behind the chapel with a shovel, a bar, a lantern, and Dellard Cobb. He had not told anybody what was happening at his house. But Dellard had seen the smooth snow on the morning of the 16th because Dellard brought the mail, and Dellard had sat in his truck at the end of that unmarked yard for a long minute before he got out. And on the 19th, Dellard came in and put the mail on the table and said, and this is in the road notes, one of only 2 places Dellard ever quoted himself. I told him, I do not know what you have done, but I know something has been done, and I am not going to ask you, and I am not going to let you go up on that hill by yourself. So there were 2 of them. What they went up to do was to find the end of Faircloth's sentence. Renner had the rectangle probed out with baling wire, 29 feet by 19, lying under the 4th, 5th, and 6th rows. He had the one worked stone marked times, step times, at the downhill sill. And in the 4 months since he made that drawing, he had read Faircloth's last page perhaps 100 times, and he had come to a conclusion about it. And the conclusion was this: it is done at the first church and not the second, and it wants a count, and the count must be, Renner reasoned, the first church is not there any more. There is no building. So whatever is done at the first church must be done on the ground of it, and the only part of the first church that is still where it was put is the foundation. And on the foundation there is exactly one feature that is not simply a wall, the step. So on the 20th of December, they dug out the doorstep of a church that came down before the Civil War in 18-degree weather in the middle of a graveyard on the shortest afternoon of the year but one. It took them 3 hours and 40 minutes. The ground was frozen 14 inches down, and they had to build a fire on it and let it work and rake it off and dig twice. And what they found is the thing that I think about when I cannot sleep. The step was a single dressed slab, 4 feet by 2.5, about 8 inches thick. It took both of them with the bar to move it, and they did not lift it out. They levered it up on its long edge and let it tip over into the hole they had dug alongside. And on the underside there was a channel cut down the middle, 2 fingers wide, fresh as the day the chisel left it. And in the channel there was writing, and the writing was numbers. But not 41 of them. There was one number, cut deep, alone in the middle of the channel of the doorstep of the first church, 311. Now, Verba Lee Hackworth had told Ellis Renner in July that the second church had buried 309, and that there was one in the fifth row put in without a service that was never entered, which made 310. And she had said times the church is not full, and that is the only good news I have got for you. And here on the underside of a stone that had been face down in the ground since before 1871, cut by somebody at some time, for some reason nobody living can tell you, was the number 311. One more. Dellard Cobb's road note for the 20th of December, 1963, is 9 words long, and it is the last road note he ever wrote about the church. We put that stone back the way it was. They put it back. They shoveled the frozen clods in on top of it, and they tamped it with the flat of the shovel, and they walked down off that slope in the dark. And Dellard drove the preacher to his own house and parked in the yard, and neither of them said anything for a while. Then Renner asked him to come in, and Dellard Cobb said, no. He said it kindly. He said, I have got a wife, and I have got a boy, and you have got neither one, and I am ashamed to say it out loud to you, but I am not staying in that house tonight. And Renner wrote, he was right, and I told him so, and I meant it, and I have never held 1 minute of it against him. He had a number to protect. I did not. Now, it did come that night, the night of the 20th, and I have not told you about it yet, because it is the one night in this whole account where Ellis Renner very nearly lost, and it did not happen the way you would expect, and I wanted you to have the doorstep and the number in your hands first. It came at 7:09. He was ready for it. He had the bar on, and the pine in his hand, and by then he had a routine, and the routine was working, and I think the routine is what almost killed him, because a man who has done a thing 7 nights running stops being frightened of it, and stops being frightened is where the door is. He wrote, I had got to where I could count for 2 hours without thinking hard about it, the way a man says grace, and that is the trouble, for grace said without thinking is not said. It come at 9 minutes after 7, and it hummed, and I counted, and about 9 o'clock it quit, and I thought, that is that. And I let go of the counting, and I sat there, and I was tired, and I was not afraid, and being not afraid felt like the first good thing that had happened to me in 11 days. And then it said, out of the dark, at the front door, plain as a neighbor, Ellis, how many are you? And I want it wrote down that I opened my mouth to answer, not to let it in. I want that understood. I opened my mouth to say 1 because I was tired, and because it had asked me a plain question, and because I have answered plain questions from the other side of that door my whole life. That is what a preacher's door is for. Somebody comes and says, how many is your congregation? How many chairs do you need? How many is coming to the dinner? And you say a number, and you go on with your evening. It did not come at me with a horror. It come at me with a courtesy. It found the one door in me that has never had a bar on it, which is that I am a man who answers people. My mouth was open, and the breath was in it. What stopped me was not sense, and it was not courage. It was that my hand was on that piece of pine, and my thumb was in the worn place, and I felt the worn place, and I thought of Verba Lee saying, it is a thing to hold, so your hands have got a job, and thinking of her was enough to put 1 second between me and it. 1 second is all it was. I have thought about that second every day since. I shut my mouth and I began to count out loud from 1, and I did not stop until 4:30 in the morning, when I fell asleep in the chair with my head down, and when I woke it was light, and I do not know how long the chair sat there with a sleeping man in it, and the house not counting. Read that last line again, because he only wrote it once, and he never came back to it, and I do not think he could stand to. He fell asleep in the chair at 4:30 in the morning on the 21st of December, with 3 hours of dark left. And nothing happened. I have no explanation for that, and neither did he, and I have decided that the honest thing is to hand it to you without one. Maybe it was already leaving. Maybe an unconscious man is not a man who can be counted with, and the whole business transeeds you awake and willing, and that is why it works so hard to keep you talking. Maybe it stood on that rock for 3 hours and looked at a sleeping man through a window and could not do one single thing about it, which is a thought I find almost funny, and I keep it around for the bad nights. Or maybe, and this is the one I do not like, maybe it wanted him awake for the following night and let him have that last hour of sleep the way you let a man rest before you ask him to lift something. He woke at 7:40 in the morning on the 21st of December, 1963, with his neck ruined from the chair and his voice half gone, and he lifted the bar and opened the door, and he wrote 2 sentences about the morning. The snow was smooth again to the road, and there was one thing that was not there yesterday, which is that the flat rock at my step had been swept in December. Bare rock, in the middle of a snow-covered yard, brushed clean. The tidying was still going on. Whatever else was happening, that had not stopped, and this time it was not the tree line 70 yards up a slope from an empty church. It was the step he stood on to come out of his own house. And I want to point at one more thing before we go into the last night, because it took me 3 readings to catch it, and once you see it, you cannot stop seeing it. Go back through everything I have told you tonight, and count how many times this thing shows up somewhere it has not been invited. The graveyard, where the blessing had been said 310 times. The church bench, which is the ground of the first church and the second. The Ratliff's window, a 1/4 mile below the church. And Renner's door. That is the whole list. 4 places, and every one of them is a place where somebody said the 4th line, or a place where somebody who said the 4th line is standing. It never went to the store at the mouth of the hollow. It never went to the school. It never went to the 19 households in between. Docia Ratliff heard nothing and saw nothing, and her only contact with any of this in her whole life was her 6-year-old at a window on the 14th of December, and the Ratliff place was the closest house to the church, and Sim Ratliff had been the man with 4 lamps that went low in unison in July of 1961. It is not roaming that hollow. It never was. It is following the sentence. That is the 20th. 2 nights to the longest night. Now, before I take you into it, and it is coming, and it is the reason you clicked on this, let me say one short thing, because we are deep in the dark here, and I know a lot of you have been with me the whole way. If you are still with me this far in, drop a fire in the comments so I know to keep making these long. That is all. Back to it. The 21st of December, 1963, was a Saturday. Sundown at 5:19. Sunrise the next morning at 7:40. 14 hours and 21 minutes of dark and a clear sky and a low of 4 degrees above zero. Here is what Ellis Renner did to get ready, and I want to lay it out like a list, because he laid it out like a list. He filled the coal bucket twice and set both by the stove, so he would not have to go out to the shed. He filled 2 buckets of water at the pump and set them inside. He put the bar on the front door and the bar on the back door, and then he took the kitchen table and set it against the front door and put the flour barrel on the table. He unscrewed every light bulb in the house except the kitchen one, because he had noticed on the 18th that when he was in the kitchen and there was a light burning in the front room, he kept looking at the doorway between them. He set the alarm clock on the table where he could see it. He got out the piece of white pine. And then he did a thing that nobody told him to do, that is not in Faircloth and is not in Verbalese rules, and that, I believe, is the single reason he survived the night. He wrote out, on a sheet of paper, in a column, the numbers from 1 to 500, and then on another sheet, 501 to 1,000. 6 sheets, 6,000 numbers. In his own handwriting, in ink, he wrote in the notebook, I had learned in October that the failure does not come from the mouth, it comes from the mind, and that what fails is not the counting, but the certainty that you have counted. So I made it so I would not have to be certain. I would read them. A man can read a great deal longer than he can remember. That is not superstition. That is a systems engineer's answer to a supernatural problem. Everything about Ellis Renner is in that decision. At 5:19, the sun went behind the west ridge. At about 6:30, he lit the lamp and sat down and began to read the numbers out loud. At 7:11, it came. I am going to read you the account of that night, nearly whole, from the notebook, and I am going to break in a few times because there are things you will miss otherwise. It runs about 9 pages in his hand. It is the longest thing he ever wrote. At 11 minutes after 7, it hummed at the kitchen window. The same 4 notes. I did not stop reading. I was at 340, and I read 341, 342, and my voice did not do anything I did not ask it to do, and I was proud of that for about a minute, and then I was ashamed of being proud, and then I let both of those go and read. It hummed the 4 notes about every half minute for an hour. I did not look at the window. The window is over the sink, and it is 4 feet from where I sat, and there is no curtain on it because Ruth Ann took the curtain down in '59 to wash it, and it never went back up. And after she died, I did not have any idea where. It was. At about 8:15, it quit humming and went round to the front door. I know it went round because I heard the step. There is a flat rock at the front step, and the sound of a foot on that rock is a sound I have heard 10,000 times. It stood on that rock, and it said, Ellis. I read 394. It said, Ellis, it is cold. Stop, right there, because this is the first time in this entire case that the thing says anything except a name or a number. Up to this point, from a 9-year-old girl with 2 goats in 1961 to a 6-year-old boy at a window in 1963, every single utterance we have from this thing is one of 3 types. A name, a question about a quantity, or an agreement with a quantity. And now it is talking, which means that in the 12 days since the 9th of December, in the 12 days since a preacher said an invitation out loud in the open air over a grave, it had gotten enough of a foothold to make sentences. Keep going. It said, Ellis, it is cold. And then it said, let me in. I have been up at that church since 11 o'clock, and I want to put down here what that sentence did to me, because a man reading this needs to know that I did not sit there like a stone. My wife said that to me in the January of '58 when she come home from decorating for the funeral of Press Hackworth's boy and stood on that rock and said, Ellis, it is cold. Let me in. I have been up at that church since 11 o'clock. I have not thought about that day in 5 years. It said it right. It said it with the little breath she used to take in the middle from the walk. I got to 406, and my voice went. And I sat there with my mouth open, making no sound, for I do not know how long. And in the quiet, it said it again, exactly the same breath in the middle. And then a 3rd time. And the 3rd time was what saved me, because the 3rd time I heard it, it was the same. Not similar, the same length, the same breath in the same place, the same little scrape on the word cold. A person does not say a thing twice the same. A person says it, and then if they say it again, they say it shorter or louder, or they get put out and say it different. It was playing me, the one it had. I got hold of my voice, and I read 407, and I did not stop again for a long time. That is the first failure of the ritual. And he came back from it. And he came back from it because of a rule an 88-year-old woman gave him on a porch in July. Listen to the end of the sentence. He listened to the whole of it, 3 times, and heard a recording. Now here is the middle of that night, and it is the worst part. Somewhere after midnight, it stopped talking and it began to sing. It sang, There is a Fountain, all the way through, All 5 verses, in her voice, on the front step, in the cold, with a bar on the door between us. I read numbers over the top of it. I got to 2,100 and something, and on the last line of the last verse it did not hum. It sang it. She never in her life sang that line. Not once in 18 years at that organ. Not in the house, not in the garden, not the day we were married. She hummed the last line of every hymn there is because she said her voice broke on an ending. It sang it, clean, all the way to the end. It could not do otherwise. It has not got the end of anything of its own, so it takes the ends off of everything it can reach, and it cannot leave a thing unfinished, and that is what it is, and that is the only thing in this world it cannot help. And when it finished that line, I began to cry, and I kept reading numbers while I cried, and I have never told this to anybody, and will not, but I want it written that a man can do both at once. And if you are somebody who has got to do both at once some night, you can. I need to say something here, and then we will go on. That is the heart of this whole thing, and it is why I keep coming back to this case out of all the ones I have. The thing on that step had everything. It had her voice, the roughness in it from the last winter, the breath in the middle of the sentence, a day in January of 1958 that Renner himself had forgotten. It had 5 verses of a hymn note perfect. Whatever it is, it had gone through that man's dead wife like a hand going through a drawer, and it had come out holding everything, and it lost him on 4 notes she wouldn't sing. Because the dead woman was incomplete, and the thing pretending to be her was not, and completeness was the only mistake it was capable of making. Now, the last part of the night. At about 3 in the morning it went quiet, and I do not know for how long. I had 4 sheets read through, and I was on the 5th, and my throat was gone to nothing, and I had drunk 1 of the 2 buckets of water. Then the front door moved. Not the latch, the door. It come in against the bar about a ½ inch, the way a door does when there is a weight put against it, and the bar took it, and the flour barrel on the table shifted maybe an inch and stopped. It did that 4 times, slow, with a rest between, like a man testing a fence, and then it went round the house. I heard it on the north side. I heard it at the back door. It did not try the back door. It went on around to the branch side, where there is nothing but the 6 foot to the bank, and it stopped there, at the little window of the back room, which is the room with the cot in it, which is the room I sleep in, which is the only window in that house I had not thought about one time all evening. And it said, in her voice, "I am going to count us," and I understood then what it had been doing at that house for 7 nights, and what it had done at the Ratliffs, and what it done to that slavin' girl in '61 with her 2 goats, and what Faircloth had wrote in 1913, and I had read in the loft, and had not understood in my bones until that minute. It does not have a number. It is not one of anything. It cannot be one until somebody counts it. It said, "I am going to count us." 1, and it waited. It waited for me to say 2. Sit with that. 14 hours of dark. A voice you loved on the other side of a bolted door. A hymn sung whole. And after all of it, the entire attack, the whole point of every hour of it, is one word. It says ×1. And it waits for you to say ×2. Because if you say ×2, then there are 2 of you, and it is the second one. And a thing that is the second one is a thing that is times in the count. And Cornelius Ott Faircloth wrote in 1913 that it does not stand anywhere in the room. It stands in the count, and once it is in the count it is in. That is the whole mechanism. That is what the 4th line of the blessing does. And what is not with you? Let it come after times. It is a sentence that says, times there is one more than you can see, and it is welcome. 90 years of saying that indoors put it in the jar. One man saying it outdoors put it in the yard. And this, the counting, at a window At 3 in the morning, in the voice of a dead wife, this was it coming for the last piece. I did not say 2. I will tell you what I did, and it is not brave, and I do not want it wrote down anywhere that it was brave. I put my hands over my ears like a child, and I bent over that sheet of paper with the lamp on it, and I read the numbers off the page loud enough to hear my own bones, and I did not listen to what was under it. I read from 4,000 and something to 500, and I lost my place and read the same page twice, and I did not care. It said, 1, I do not know how many times. I was not listening. I have thought since that the not listening was as important as the counting, though I did it out of fear and not out of sense. At some point I was reading and I could not remember starting the page. At some point the lamp was low, and then I looked up, and there was gray in the window over the sink, and the clock said 7:44, and I was still saying numbers, and I had been saying them so long that I said 4 more after I knew I could stop. That is the night of the 21st of December, 1963, 14 hours and 21 minutes. He read the numbers from 1 to 1,000, somewhere between 6 and 7 times through. His voice did not come back properly for 9 days, and never entirely came back at all. The low, even water over a flat rock voice that got him the pulpit at 21 years old had a rasp in it for the rest of his life, and people who met him after 1963 assumed he was a smoker, and he was not. And when it got light, he took the flour barrel off the table and moved the table and lifted the bar and opened the front door. There were no tracks, but there was something on the flat rock at the step. He wrote 1 line about it, and it is the only thing in the entire notebook that he never explains, never returns to, and never mentions again. There was a curtain folded on the step, and it was the kitchen curtain, and it had been washed. He did not go back in the house. He put on his coat, which he had been wearing all night anyway, and he put the piece of white pine in his pocket, and at about 8 o'clock on the morning of the 22nd of December, 1963, he walked 3.5 miles up the hollow to Verba Lee Hackworth's house. It took him 2 hours in the snow. He was 43 years old, and he had not slept, and his voice was gone, and he walked the whole way up the middle of the road, and he wrote that he did not once look at the tree line, and that this was the only stretch of that whole winter where he was afraid in the ordinary way, the way an animal is afraid, rather than in the cold, thinking way he had been afraid all night. She was expecting him. There is no way she could have been, and she was. He wrote that there was a fire up and 2 cups on the table, and she did not say good morning. She said, "Sit down and do not talk yet." He sat there for 20 minutes without speaking. Then she asked him what it had said, and he told her, and when he got to times I am going to count us 1 times, she got up and went to the window and stood there with her back to him. And then Verba Lee Hackworth, 88 years old, who had told him in July that she would not speak of it again to him or to anybody, spoke of it. Here is the passage. It is the last long piece of the notebook, and it is the one I would save if I could only save 1. She said, "You did not say 2. I said no. She said, "Then you are the first one since Tabor's people that has stood in front of it all night and not give it anything. Faircloth, give it something." He wrote it down, and that was giving it something, for a written number is a said number that is waiting on a mouth. My brother give it something in 1931, and it took his little girl, and we buried her in the 2nd row, and I have not said her name out loud since, and I am not going to start now. And then she said, "Ask me the question again." I said, "Is there a way to make it let a person go?" And she said, "There is. And you have been standing on the wrong side of it all winter, and I am going to tell you now because you have earned it, and because I am dying, and it ought not to go in the ground with me." She said, "It cannot be 1. That is its whole trouble. It has been trying to be 1 since before there was anybody here to count. It cannot say a number for itself. It has to be give one. That is why it asks the children. That is why it stands at the window and says one, and waits, for it can say the first one, it just cannot say the second, and the second one is the one that means there is another besides you. I said I understood that. She said, then understand the rest. If it cannot be one on its own, it can be made one by somebody willing. A person may stand on that ground, in the open, and count out loud, and count it in, 1, and then 2, and the 2 is it. And when it is 2, it is in the count, and it is in. But it is in a count of 2, and a count of 2 has got 2 ends to it, and it will take the one that offered. I said, and what happens to whoever it was holding? She said, it lets them go. It has got somebody now. And then she turned around and looked at me, and she said, that is what Faircloth was writing when he quit writing. He had it off my grandmother in 1893. His wife was gone 11 days by then. He wrote it down as far as the count must be. And then he put his pen down, and he did not finish the sentence. I said, why did he not finish it? And she said, because he had quit writing and gone to do it. That is what happened to Cornelius Ott Faircloth. That is why there is no death record. That is why the last document with his name on it is a coal receipt from the 4th of December, 1922, and then nothing, ever again, in any county touching that one. He put down his pen in the middle of a sentence, and he walked up that slope in the dark, and he stood on the foundation of the first church, and he counted his wife out and himself in. And I told you at the beginning that a 9-foot sill stone was cut with 41 counts on the underside, and that the last one was 41, and I told you there would be 4 times that number came up. That was the first. The stove was the second. The 41 names on Marlon Pruitt's list in 1978 was, I will admit to you, a coincidence. And I put it in because I wanted you to have it. Here is the 4th and last, and it is not a coincidence. Marlon Pruitt's 20th interview, the hot Tuesday afternoon in 1978, in the house with the curtains drawn, 4 hours and 11 minutes of an old man talking about a church, was not with a folk singer. Pruitt had gone to that house because somebody at a store told him the man there knew the old hymns. The old man's name was Elmer Cobble, and he was 91, and he was the same Elmer Cobble who had opened a grave in the 5th row in August of 1912 and struck stone at 3 feet. And on that tape, at about the 2-hour mark, in answer to a question about the singing, Elmer Cobble says a thing that nobody has ever been able to make fit anywhere else. He says, there was a woman come to Black Branch in the summer of 23, after the preacher went off, and she stayed at Sowash's a while, and then she went, and nobody would say who she was. Pruitt asks him, on the tape, who he thought she was. And Elmer Cobble says, I know who she was. She was Nanny Faircloth. She had been gone a year and some. I seen her at the store, and she bought thread. Nanny Sowash Faircloth disappeared in the December of 1922. The branch was dragged below the shoals, and she was not in the branch. And a year later, a woman that a 19-year-old boy recognized on sight was standing at the counter at the store buying thread. He let her go. It worked. That is what Ellis Renner was told on the morning of the 22nd of December, 1963, by a dying woman in a kitchen at the head of a hollow. That there was a way, and that it had been used once, and that it had worked, and that the price of it was the man who used it. And then she told him the last part. And this is the part that he wrote out in a hand that got smaller and smaller until the last 4 words are almost nothing on the page. She said, now I will tell you why I would not say it in July. It is not because of you and your wife, though that is what I said and it was half true. It is because of the count, 310 in that ground. And that stone under the door of the first church has got 311 on it, which you have seen for yourself, which is why you come up here white as a sheet in December, instead of waiting for a thaw. She said, 311 fills it. That is what full is. My mother told me, and her aunt told her, it has been 311 since before the road. I said, then when the next person in this hollow dies? And she said, no, not when they die. When they are buried and the 4 lines are said over them, it is not the body that goes in the jar, preacher. It is the blessing. 310 times somebody has stood in that room and said, let it come after, and every time it come after, and it went in, and the house held it. 311, and the house does not hold anything anymore, and there is not another Tabor in the world to come over the mountain and take it down and know why he is doing it. And she said, I am 88, and I have got a bad heart, and I will be the 311th, and you are going to bury me, and you are going to say 3 lines. I said I would. She said, say it again. I said, 3 lines. And she said, then that is done, and I can quit. Verba Lee Hackworth died on the 4th of January, 1964, in her own bed of what the certificate calls chronic myocarditis, which is a doctor's way of saying an 88-year-old heart quit. Ellis Renner buried her on the 7th. It was in the church. The chapel had been cleaned by then. The smoke scrubbed off the whitewash by a work party of 9 women over 2 days in the last week of December, and the pipe replaced. 39 people came. It was the largest funeral in that hollow in 19 years, because whatever else she was, she had been the woman with the garden, and she had sat up with half the sick in that hollow for 60 years, and people came. He preached 17 minutes, and at the end of it, standing on 3 steps made out of the doorstep of a church that came down before the Civil War, in front of 39 people who had heard the same 4 lines, said over their fathers and their mothers and their children, Ellis Tate Renner said, go out from here in the quiet. Go out from here in the light that is left. Go by the water and go by the ridge and be counted home. And then he closed his mouth and stood there. Nobody moved. Dellard Cobb wrote, in the last road note in that book, dated the 7th of January, 1964, he stopped at 3. Nobody said a word. Ivalie Slavin started to, and I put my hand on her arm, and she left it alone. We went out in the snow. I have never in my life been so glad to hear a man not say something. 310. The jar did not fill, and Ellis Renner never said the 4th line of that blessing again, not that day, not the following Sunday, not in the 27 years he had left, not in another state, not in another church, not over a table, not over his own supper, not once, ever, for the rest of his life. Now, you want to know if it stopped. I want to be careful with you here, because this is the place where a story like this usually cheats. The honest answer is that it changed, and that the change is documented, and that nobody can tell you what the change meant. Here is what we know about Black Branch in the year 1964. It came to the parsonage 11 more times between the 22nd of December and the end of February. Renner logged every one. The last was the 26th of February, 1964. After that, nothing, for the rest of his time there. The 11 visits were not like the first 7. It did not sing, it did not say his name, it did not ask a number. It stood on the flat rock at the front step, and it waited, and then it went away. He wrote, "It does not knock, and it does not speak, and I do not know how I know it is there, except that I do. The way you know somebody is in a room behind you. I sit and read numbers for 2 hours, and then the feeling goes off, and I go to bed. I have thought about why it has quit talking to me. The only answer I have got is that it has quit talking to me the way a man quits arguing with somebody who has already told him no, or it is waiting to see whether I will bury somebody." The tree line closed back in. That is the detail that undoes me. Through the spring and summer of 1964, the briar came back along the top of the graveyard, sumac, blackberry, the whole junk growth mat. And by the August of that year, the church bench had the same messy edge it had all his life. Dellard Cobb has it in the road notes, which he kept for another decade, even though he never wrote about the church again after January. Aug. 4, 64. Briar is back thick along the graveyard fence. Fence posts leaning again. 3 of them bad. It is like it was. Something stopped keeping that yard. Now, you can read that 2 ways, and I am going to give you both, and I am not going to tell you which one I believe, because I have gone back and forth for a long time. The first reading is the comfortable one. It lost. He did not answer. He did not count it in. The jar did not fill, and whatever had been standing in the count out there went back down into whatever a thin place is. And the briar grew, and the world went on. The second reading is the one that keeps me up. A thing tidies a yard when it is going to use the yard. It stops tidying when it is not. And there are 2 reasons a thing stops planning to use a yard. One is that it has given up. The other is that it has already got what it needed and does not have to come to the door anymore. Hold that. There is one more piece of it at the very end, and I am going to make you wait for it. In the June of 1964, Ellis Renner resigned the pulpit at Black Branch Chapel. He gave notice at a business meeting on the 7th of June and preached his last sermon on the 28th of July. 23 years and 4 months. The minutes of that meeting exist in the hand of a secretary named Ollie Mae Kitchen, and they say, in full, Bro, Renner has asked to be released on account of his health. Motion by D. Cobb to accept with thanks and a purse. Carried, all in favor, nobody opposed. Bro. Renner asked that whoever comes be told the blessing is give in 3 lines here now, and not 4, and that it is not to be argued about. Motion by D. Cobb, that it be wrote down in the book that way. Carried. Motion by D. Cobb, that it be wrote down in the book that way. Dellard Cobb made both motions. Dellard Cobb, who had seen the smooth snow, and who had dug a doorstep out of frozen ground in December and read a number off the underside of it by lantern light, and who had refused to go into a man's house on the night of the 20th and been forgiven for it. Dellard Cobb made sure the 3 lines went in the church book so it would outlive the man who decided it. And it did. There is a Black Branch Chapel church book covering 1940 to 1974, and on the page for the 7th of June, 1964, in a woman's careful hand, it says, the blessing is given in 3 lines, here, now, and not 4, and it is not to be argued about. 3 more preachers stood in that pulpit after Renner. All 3 of them gave 3 lines. Nobody ever argued about it. That is the most West Virginia detail in this entire case, and I love it more than I can tell you. 106 people quietly agreed, forever, to stop saying 4 words at the end of a prayer, and not one of them ever asked out loud what would happen if they didn't. Black Branch Chapel held its last service on the 14th of April, 1974. The congregation was down to 9. The building stood empty for 11 years, and the roof went in the winter of '85. What is left of it now is the stone foundation, which is the foundation of the first church, which is 100 and some years older than the building that sat on it, and which is still there, and which is not going anywhere. The graveyard is still maintained. There is a fund. Somebody mows it twice a summer. 322 burials, at last count, and not one of them, since the 7th of January, 1964, has had 4 lines said over it. Now, Ellis Renner. He left Collie County on the 19th of August, 1964, and he did not come back for 11 years. He went to Ohio. He took a church in a town north of Columbus, a small congregational church in a town of 4,000 people, flat farm country, the kind of landscape where you can see a car coming for 2 miles. I do not think that was an accident. He served there from 1964 to 1981, and then part-time until 1986, and he was, by every account of everyone who knew him there, a beloved and completely ordinary pastor. He never remarried. And here is the part of this story that I actually find the saddest, and it has no ghosts in it at all. Nobody in Ohio ever knew. For 22 years he stood in front of people in a flat green town and gave a blessing that stopped 1 line short, and not a single person there had any idea that there had ever been a 4th line, because it was not their blessing. It was a local thing from a hollow 6 hours away that most of them could not have found on a map. In Ohio, 3 lines was simply how Reverend Renner ended a service. It was one of those little idiosyncrasies you get with a preacher. People found it nice. One woman told an interviewer in the 1990s that she had always thought it was lovely how he ended things. Times be counted home. Times because it sounded like a promise without asking for anything. He carried it alone for 22 years in a town where it did not even register as strange. But the marks were there if you knew to look, and people did notice, and they noticed the same 4 things over and over, and they all noticed them without ever once putting them together. Because why would you? The first was the doors. Ellis Renner barred doors. Not locked barred. He put a bar bracket on the inside of the front and back doors of the parsonage in Ohio within a month of moving in, and he made them himself. And when the church trustees replaced that parsonage in 1971 and built a new brick one, he installed brackets in that one too, on doors that had perfectly good deadbolts. The trustees thought it was a country habit. One of them, a farmer named Warren Dietz, told the story for years about helping the preacher move and finding him in the new house at 8 o'clock at night with a chisel, cutting a bracket seat into a brand new door frame. Dietz said he asked him, "You expecting somebody?" And Renner said, and Dietz told this the same way every time. Renner said, "Not expecting, just not leaving it up to them." The second thing was the counting. He counted the house, every service, every wedding, every funeral, every potluck, every board meeting. Out loud sometimes, under his breath, moving his lips, tapping the pew back with 2 fingers. People assumed he was doing attendance, and, to be fair, part of him was. But he did it at ball games, too. He did it in restaurants. There is a story from a church trip to a museum in 1977 where he counted the group 4 times in the parking lot and would not let the bus leave until he had gotten the same number twice in a row. A teenager on that trip, a girl named Peg Ammons, who is the reason we have several of these stories, because she grew up to be a newspaper reporter, asked him why he did it. She wrote down his answer that same day in a diary, which is why we have it word for word. He said, "Because if you do not know how many you are, somebody will tell you." The third thing was that he would not go outside after dark. Not times could, times not. Would not. And he was smooth about it, and it took people years to notice. He did evening services, and then went directly from the door of the church to the door of the car, to the door of the house. He did not do outdoor evening events. In 18 years, he attended exactly 1 nighttime funeral home visitation, and he was the first one there, before sundown. And he left with 2 other families walking out at the same time. He turned down a fishing invitation every summer for a decade with the same joke, which was that he had done his fishing. The fourth thing was the wood. He carried a piece of white pine, about 11 inches long, in his right coat pocket. Every coat, every day, for 27 years. Peg Ammons asked him about that too when she was 17, because that is what 17-year-olds are for. He told her it was from a church. She asked which church, and he said, "The first one. There is a 5th thing, and it is not on anybody's list of his habits, because only one person ever noticed it, and she did not understand what she was looking at until she was in her 40s and reading a photocopy of a dead man's notebook at a kitchen table in Ohio. Peg Ammons noticed, when she was a teenager, that Reverend Renner never let a hymn end. He did not sing the last line. Every Sunday, in a church in a flat farm town, in a congregation of 90-some people, the preacher sang every verse of every hymn in a fair baritone, and then, on the last line of the last verse, stopped singing and hummed it. She thought he was clearing his throat. She thought it was a country thing. She thought, when she was 15, and it annoyed her, that it was an affectation. She found out what it was 26 years later, on page 71 of a notebook written in the spring of 1964, in a sentence about a woman at a pump organ who said her voice broke on an ending. He had taken it up. Sometime between the 22nd of December, 1963, and the day he stood up in front of strangers in Ohio, Ellis Renner had started doing the one thing his wife did that the thing outside his door could not do, and he did it in public, every week, for 22 years, and nobody ever asked him about it, and if anybody had, I do not know what he would have said. I know what I think it was. I think it was two things at once, which is how people actually work. I think part of it was a widower keeping a small piece of somebody, the way you keep a coat, and I think part of it was a man leaving one thing unfinished, out loud, in a room full of people, every 7 days, on purpose, the way you leave a light on. In the October of 1975, Ellis Renner went back to Black Branch. He was 55 years old. He had been gone 11 years. He drove down on a Friday in a 1972 Plymouth, and he stayed 2 nights at the house of Dellard Cobb, who had closed the store the year before and was in poor health. And on the Saturday, the two of them drove up the hollow to the chapel, which had been empty for 18 months by then and still had its roof. We know what happened on that Saturday from 3 sources. A short account Renner wrote on the back of a church bulletin, Dellard Cobb's telling of it to his son, and a much later letter. They got there about 2 in the afternoon. The building was unlocked, because there was nothing in it worth locking up. Renner went in. He wrote, "It was smaller than I remembered it, which is the thing every man says, and it was true, and there is no help for it." The hymnal with the broke spine was still in the rack of the 4th pew. 11 years. Nobody had moved it. Nobody had moved anything. That building was exactly as we left it in 74, and I would have swore it was exactly as I left it in 64. I went up on the pulpit steps, 3 steps. I stood on the top one, which is the one with the channel cut in the underside, and I looked out at 14 empty pews. And I want to record that I felt nothing at all, no dread, nothing, only that I was an old fool standing in a dusty room. Then I went out and up the slope to the graveyard, and I stood at the 4th row, 7 stones from the east fence, for about a quarter of an hour, and I did not say anything to her, because I have never in my life believed a person is in the ground, and then I came back down. And it was on the way back down that I saw it, and I do not know what to make of it, and I am setting it here. The grass on the church bench had been cut, not mowed. There is no mower been on that bench since 73. Cut, the way ground gets cut, when something has been eating it or when it has been kept, and the briar along the top of the graveyard was gone again. From the gate to the northeast corner, about 110 feet, clean to the trunks, 110 feet. That is exactly the figure he wrote down on the 14th of April, 1963, the first time he measured it. From the gate to the northeast corner, 110 feet, the woods now start clean. 12 years later, to the foot. It had started over. Dellard Cobb's version of that afternoon, as told to his son and recorded by Marlon Pruitt 3 years later, adds one detail that Renner did not write down, and it is a detail I think about a great deal. Dellard said that the preacher stood at the bottom of the graveyard looking up at that clean ground for a long while, And then he said, very quietly, not really to Dellard, "There is nobody here to say it. There has not been a service in that building in 18 months. What is it getting ready for?" And Dellard, who was a practical man his whole life, said, "Maybe it does not know we are done." And Renner said, "And this is the line, or it knows something is coming that I have not thought of." They drove down. Renner left Sunday morning. He never went back to Cawley County again, not for Dellard Cobb's funeral in 1979, not for anything. Now, the letter. In the November of 1978, a graduate student named Marlon Pruitt, having spent a summer with a tape recorder in that county, having sat 4 hours and 11 minutes with a 91-year-old man named Elmer Cobble, having heard a woman named Dosia Ratliff describe her 6-year-old son correcting a stranger's arithmetic through a window, Pruitt wrote a letter to a preacher in Ohio. He asked 11 questions. He was polite. He said he was working on hymn variation and had come across some material about the blessing at Black Branch and would be grateful for any recollections. Ellis Renner wrote back on the 2nd of December, 1978. The letter is 1 page. It is the 5th item in that cardboard box, in carbon copy, because he kept a carbon of it, which tells you he expected somebody to read it eventually. Here it is, entire. Dear Mr. Pruitt, I have your letter of the 14th, and I thank you for the courtesy of it. I am going to answer you honestly, and then I am going to ask you to stop. Yes, the blessing at Black Branch had 4 lines and now has 3. Yes, I am the man who took the 4th one out. No, it was not a doctrinal matter, and there was no dispute in the congregation about it. Nobody ever asked me why, in 23 years, and I have decided that this is the single kindest thing that was ever done for me by anybody. You ask what the 4th line was? I am not going to write it out. Not because it is a secret, because it is a sentence, and a sentence written down is a sentence waiting on a mouth. And you are a young man and you have got a tape recorder, and I do not know what you would do with it. You ask whether anything happened. Something happened. It happened to me in the winter of 1963, and it went on into 1964, and I have wrote out an account of it, which I am not going to send you, and which will be found among my things when I am gone. And you may have it then, if you are still interested, and I hope by then you will not be. You ask, last, whether I still believe in it. Mr. Pruitt, I am 58 years old. I have preached at 400 and some funerals. I have sat with people who were dying, and I have never once in my life told any of them something I did not believe. So, I will tell you. I do not know what it was. I never did. I have got 2 ideas, and they do not agree, and I have had them both for 15 years. The first idea is that there is thin ground in this world, and that on the thin ground a thing may stand in the count that has no business standing anywhere, and that it wants a number of its own more than anything, and it will get one out of us if we hand it over. The second idea is that there is nothing there at all, and that a hollow with 4 hours and 40 minutes of sun in the winter will do the rest, and that a lonesome man who has buried his wife will hear her voice on the step, because that is what a mind is for, and that I have spent 15 years carrying a piece of wood in my pocket like a fool. I hold both. I have never been able to put either one down, but I will tell you which one I act like. Every night of my life I bar the door of my house, and if I hear a voice I know outside of it, I count out loud until it quits, and I have had to do that twice since I came to Ohio, and I did not write those 2 nights down anywhere, and I am not going to. Please do not write to me again about this. I am not angry. I wish you well in your work. Yours, E. T. Renner. I have had to do that twice since I came to Ohio, 14 years. 2 nights. In a flat farm town 6 hours from that hollow, he never wrote them down. We do not know when they were, or what it said, or whose voice it used, and I have come to believe that he left them out on purpose, the way he left out whether the stove was cold on the 8th of March, 1963. There is a kind of noticing that a careful person avoids for as long as they possibly can. Now, the last night of this story is in the November of 1990, and it is not a night of terror, and I want you to be ready for that, because I think it is worse. Ellis Renner was 70 years old. He had retired fully in 1986. He was living alone in a small house on 5th Street in that Ohio town, 2 blocks from the church, and he had congestive heart failure and a bad hip, and he had gotten thin. Peg Ammons, the girl from the museum trip, who was by then 30 and a reporter at a paper in the next county, overcame to see him on the 12th of November, 1990, because her mother had told her he was not doing well. She stayed 2 hours. She wrote about it years later in a first-person column that is the only reason any of this is public at all, and if you have ever heard this case told anywhere before, it came from her column, and she got most of it right. She said the house was very warm and very neat. She said he had the numbers taped up. That is the detail that broke me the first time I read it. On the wall of the front room, beside the chair where he sat, he had taped up 6 sheets of paper, and on them, in his own hand, in ink, were the numbers from 1 to 1,000. Not the originals from 1963 new ones. He had written them out again at some point when his hands were still good enough, so that when they were not, he would still be able to read them. She asked him about it, and he said, "That is in case I get to where I cannot keep track." And she said, "Keep track of what?" And he said, "Of how many of us there are in the room." Then he said, and she wrote it down in the car afterward, "Peg, there is one of us in this room. You know that, and I know that. It is a nice afternoon, and there is one. But some evening there is going to be a bad hour where I am not sure, and I would like to have it wrote down." He died on the 29th of January, 1991, at 70 years old, in a hospital in Columbus, of heart failure, with a niece from Charleston in the room. The niece, whose name was Dorothy, told Peg Ammons 2 things about the last day, and I am going to give them to you exactly as they were given, and then I am going to tell you what was in the box, and then we are done. The first is that at some point in the afternoon he became agitated and asked her twice how many people were in the room, and she said, "Just me, Uncle Ellis," and he said, "That is not a number." She said, "1. "There is 1," and he said, "Say 2." And she said, "There is not 2." And he said, "I know it. Say 2 anyway. I want to hear somebody say it out loud in a room I am in and have nothing happen." So she said 2, and nothing happened. And he laughed. A 70-year-old dying man laughed out loud in a hospital room in Columbus, Ohio, and he said, "All right then." The second thing she told is that he had his coat with him on a hook in the room, and that his right hand went to the pocket of it 4 or 5 times during the last 2 days, feeling for something, and that after he died she went and looked in the pocket to see what it was. It was a piece of white pine about 11 inches long, worn dark and smooth in the middle, 1/4 of an inch deep. The box. I told you at the start of this that there was a cardboard box in the basement of a county courthouse annex, catalogued in a clerk's hand as times effects. Unclaimed Renner E.T., and that there were 7 things in it, and that I would tell you every one before we were done. How it got there is a small, sad piece of paperwork. Renner had no children. His niece Dorothy handled the funeral and took the personal things she wanted, and the rest, the papers, mostly she sent back to Cawley County in the spring of 1991, with a note asking that they be given to whoever was keeping the records for Black Branch Chapel. But Black Branch Chapel had been closed for 17 years by then, and had no session, no trustees, and no address. So the box went to the county, and the county put it in the annex basement, and it sat there for a very long time. Here is what was in it. The first item is the spiral notebook. 112 pages, written in the spring of 1964. Ink, both sides. On the inside cover, in a different and much later handshake here, an old man's is written, "This is a true account. I have not improved it. ETR 1989. That is where nearly everything I have read you tonight comes from." The second item is the piece of white pine. 11 inches, worn dark, a quarter-inch hollow in the middle where a hand held it. Somebody at some point put it in a small manila envelope and wrote Times Wood on the outside. The third item is the sermon file for 1963, including the 14 back-page entries, the list titled Times Explanations, the probe map of the first church drawn on the back of a 1959 calendar page, and the Christmas sermon about the census in Luke, which he preached on the 24th of December, 1963, 2 days after walking 3.5 miles through the snow. The fourth item is a photograph. It is the only one in the box. It is Ruth Ann Renner, sitting at the pump organ at Black Branch Chapel, taken from the side, probably at a wedding, probably in the middle 1950s. She is turned partly away from the camera. You cannot see her face clearly. On the back, in his hand, is written R.A.R. Organ Ratliff Wedding. She is humming here. The fifth item is the carbon of the letter to Marlon Pruitt. The sixth item is a single sheet of paper, folded in 4, worn soft at the folds the way paper gets when it has been opened and closed many hundreds of times. On it, in ink, are the numbers 1 through 500. Just one of the 6 sheets. He kept one. And the seventh item is the church book. Cornelius Ott Faircloth's church book, 1904 to 1922, 241 pages, the last page of writing ending mid-sentence at times, and the count must be, he took it with him to Ohio. Of course he did. He carried that ledger out of that hollow in August of 1964 and kept it in his house for 27 years, in a flat green town where nobody knew what it was, and he never gave it to a library or a historical society or a folklorist who asked politely, and I have thought a long time about why. I think it is because Faircloth had nobody. I think Renner, who had 106 people in a hollow and then 4,000 in a town, and who was alone in the middle of both, understood better than anybody alive what it is to be the only person carrying a thing, and he was not going to leave that man's last sentence to sit in a loft under a hornet's nest for another 50 years. Somebody ought to be holding it. So he held it. Now a few things I owe you, because I have left several threads hanging on purpose, and I do not like to leave a house with the doors open. The first is the curtain. There was a curtain folded on the step, and it was the kitchen curtain, and it had been washed. He never explained it. He never mentioned it again in 112 pages. And there is no explanation available, so instead I will give you the only 3 facts that touch it. 1. Ruth Ann Renner took that curtain down in 1959 to wash it and never put it back up. And after she died, her husband did not know where it was. And there is no indication he ever found it in the 2.5 years he lived alone in that house. 2. It was folded. Not dropped, not laid out. Folded. 3. On the morning of the 22nd of December, 1963, Ellis Renner stepped over it, walked 3.5 miles up a hollow in the snow, and when he came back to that house 2 days later, because he did come back, he lived there another 8 months. The curtain was still on the step, and it stayed there. And he wrote nothing more about it, and when he moved out in the August of 1964, it was not among the things he took. Make of it what you will. I have made 3 different things of it on 3 different nights. The second thread is the woman at the store. Elmer Cobble, 91 years old, on tape in 1978, says that in the summer of 1923, a woman came to Black Branch. stayed at Sowash's a while, bought thread at the store, and went, and that he knew her on sight, and that she was Nanny Faircloth, who had been missing for a year and some. If that is true, then the thing Verba Lee Hackworth described to Renner on the 22nd of December is not folklore. It is a procedure with one documented success and one documented cost. And if it is true, then somewhere in this country, in the 1920s or 30s or 40s, there was a woman living under some other name who had been let go, and who knew exactly what had been done for her, and by whom, and what it had cost him. Nobody has ever found her. I have looked. There is no marriage record, no census entry, no death certificate for Nanny Sowash Faircloth in West Virginia, Kentucky, Ohio, Virginia, or Pennsylvania after 1922, which means either Elmer Cobble was a 91-year-old man misremembering a face from 55 years before, which is entirely possible, and is probably what happened, or she was very, very careful. The third thread is the one I have been holding all night, and it is the number 311, cut into the underside of a doorstep of a church that came down before 1871, alone, in a channel 2 fingers wide, fresh as the day the chisel left it. Verba Lee Hackworth said that 311 fills it, and that she would be the 311th, and that Renner would say 3 lines over her. And he did, and it did not fill. But here is the thing that nobody ever asks, and I want to ask it, and then I am going to answer it as best I can. Who cut that number? Because think about what it is. It is not a tally. The 41 counts on the sill stone are a tally, a running record of a thing that happened, added to over time, each number bigger than the last. That is a record of the past. 311, alone, on a doorstep, cut once, is not a record. It is a target. Somebody, at some point before 1871, probably when the first church came down, probably by the people Mother Bramwell called Tabor's people, the ones who broke the jar on purpose, cut a number into a stone that would not be reached for 150 years. Which means they knew there was going to be a second church. They knew somebody would take the stone and build again and start counting from 0, and they could not stop it, and so they did the only thing they could do, which was to leave a warning face down in the dirt where it would be found by exactly one kind of person, somebody digging where they should not, for a reason that was already too late. That is the coldest act of kindness I have ever come across in one of these cases. 150 years of patience, cut into 8 inches of rock, on the chance that a man with a bar and a lantern would one day be desperate enough and careful enough to turn it over and read it and stop. And he did. On the 20th of December, 1963, in 18-degree weather, a preacher and a storekeeper turned over a doorstep, read a number, put the stone back exactly as it lay, and walked down off that hill, and never told a soul who had not already been standing there. And 311 never happened. That grass is mowed twice a summer by a man on a county contract who does not know any of this. There are 322 people in the ground on that slope. The last 12 of them have had 3 lines set over them, or nothing at all, and the jar is 1 short, and has been 1 short since the 7th of January, 1964, and it will stay 1 short as long as nobody stands up on that flat ground and says 11 particular words in the open air. Which brings me, finally, to the part I have been putting off, because there is one loose end in this case that is not 100 years old, and it is the reason I picked this story out of a stack of stories, and it is the reason I have kept you here for 3 hours. In the October of 1975, Ellis Renner stood at the bottom of a graveyard and looked up at 110 feet of ground that had been cleared to the trunks in a hollow where nobody had held a service in 18 months, and said, "What is it getting ready for?" Nobody has ever answered that. And here is what I have been able to find out about that ground since. The chapel roof went in the winter of 1985. The county took the building down to the foundation in 1988 for liability reasons after a boy fell through the floor and broke his arm. The graveyard fund was set up in 1992 by descendants, mostly people living in Ohio and North Carolina by then, and it pays a man to mow twice a summer and to keep the fence. In the 2000s, a regional historical society made a survey of abandoned church sites in that part of the state. Their report on Black Branch is 2 pages. It notes the foundation, the graveyard, the 322 burials, and 1 anomaly, which they describe in the flattest possible language and which they were not able to explain. The anomaly is this: the vegetation line along the north edge of the cemetery does not behave. That is not their phrase. Their phrase is times irregular successional patterning at the northern boundary, inconsistent with adjacent parcels times, but that is what it means. Everywhere else on that slope, second-growth Appalachian woods do what second-growth Appalachian woods do, which is come in fast and messy at any edge that stops being mowed. Along the north edge of the Black Branch Cemetery, above the 4th, 5th, and 6th rows, the brush line advances and retreats. Over the survey period, it moved down toward the fence, and then back up toward the trees, and then down again. It cleared, and it came in, and it cleared. The surveyors thought it was probably the mowing contractor. I called the mowing contractor. He mows the plots and the paths. He has never cut the brush line, because it is not his contract, and it is not his equipment, and it is up a slope he cannot get a machine onto. Now, I want to be extremely careful here, and I want you to hold me to it, because this is exactly the point where a story like this stops being an account and becomes a campfire. So let me say plainly what I am not saying. I am not telling you there is something on that hill. I do not know that. Nobody knows that. Brush lines fluctuate with drought years and deer pressure and 100 other things, and a regional survey done by volunteers over a few seasons is not a controlled study of anything. What I am telling you is what is documented, and it is this. In 1963, a man wrote down that the brush along that fence line was disappearing, and he measured it, and it went from 110 feet to 240 feet to the whole graveyard side over 3 months. In 1964, it grew back. In 1975, it was clear again, to the foot, at exactly the first measurement. And in this century, people with clipboards who had never heard the name Ellis Renner wrote down that the brush line at the north boundary comes and goes for no reason they can determine. Something up there keeps starting over. And the last thing I have to give you, I have saved on purpose, because it is small, and because I think it is the worst thing in this entire case. Go back to the second reading. Remember, I gave you 2 ways to understand why the tidying stopped in 1964. The first is that it gave up. The second is that it had already gotten what it needed and did not have to come to the door anymore. For a long time, I thought the second reading was paranoid because Renner did not answer and did not say 2 and did not give it a name or a number. And the count stayed at 310. He won. Whatever winning is with a thing like that, he did it, in a kitchen chair, over 14 hours and 21 minutes, with a piece of pine in his hand. And then I read the letter to Marlin Pruitt again. I have had to do that twice since I came to Ohio. Twice. In a flat farm town, 400 miles from that hollow, on ground that has never been thin, in a house he barred every night of his life. If a thing is bound to a place, if it is the thin ground, if it is what that hollow does, then it does not get to Ohio. So either an old man was hearing things on 2 bad nights across 14 years, which is entirely possible and is what I would tell you if you asked me at noon, or something came out of that hollow with him, not in the count. He never let it in the count, but near it, behind it. The way a thing follows a man, it has not finished with the way footprints go up a hill beside yours. Same direction, longer stride. And I keep coming back to a sentence that a dying woman said on a porch in July of 1963, which Renner wrote down, and which I did not comment on at the time because I wanted you to be far enough along to feel it. It has your name off the stone, and it has your voice out of the middle of you, but it has not got your answer, and your answer is the last piece it needs. He never gave it the answer. 70 years old, in a hospital in Columbus, and he was still not sure enough to leave it alone, so he made his niece say "to" out loud in a lit room in the middle of the afternoon and waited to see what happened. That is not a man who thought it was over. That is a man who had been careful for 27 years and wanted one time, before the end, to hear somebody say a number in a room and have nothing come of it. And nothing did. I want that to be the end of it. I want to hand you the image of an old preacher laughing in a hospital bed and saying, "Time's all right then," and let that be where we leave him, because he earned it, and because he is the only person in this entire 150-year story who stood in front of that thing with everything he loved on the other side of the door and did not open it. But I promised you at the start that I would tell you every one of the 7 things in the box, and I have. And there is one thing in this case that was not in the box and that I have not mentioned, and I am going to give it to you now. Peg Ammons, in the column she wrote about him, mentions in passing that when she came to that house on 5th Street in November of 1990, the numbers taped to the wall beside his chair were 6 sheets, 1 through 1,000. The sheet in the box is numbers 1 through 500. 1 sheet, folded in 4, worn soft at the folds. Where are the other 5? They are not in the box. They were not among the things his niece took. They are not in the church's papers in Ohio, and they are not in the folklore archive at the university, and I have looked in all 3 places, and so has one other person, and neither of us has found them. Now, the ordinary explanation is that a niece cleaning out a dead man's house threw away 5 sheets of a dead man's handwritten numbers and kept one because it was folded and looked like it might have mattered to him. And that is almost certainly what happened, and I want to say clearly that I believe it. But I will tell you what I do with that fact on the nights when I am not being sensible. 6 sheets, 1 through 1,000, written out in ink by an old man with a bad heart so that when his mind went, he would still be able to read them. And what survives is the first 500. He would have started at 1, which means that if there was a night at the end, and there is no evidence there was, none, and the death certificate says heart failure, and the niece was there, and there is nothing strange in any of it. But if there was, then he did not get past the first sheet. I do not know what happened to the other 5 sheets of paper. Neither does anybody else. That is the case of Ellis Tate Renner, the last preacher at Black Branch, and the 4th line he would not say. Now, let me sit with you a while longer, because it is late and there are a few people in this story I have not finished. And I do not like to leave people unfinished. Not in this one. Not after 3 hours of a thing whose whole nature is that it finishes everything. Dellard Cobb closed the store at the mouth of Black Branch in the March of 1974 after 26 years. He was 68. He had emphysema, and he had a son in Charleston who wanted him closer. He did not move. He died in the December of 1979 in the house he was born in, and he is in the 2nd row of that graveyard. And he had 3 lines said over him by a preacher out of Beckley who had never met him, and who had been told, when he took the job, that the blessing is given in 3 lines here, and it is not to be argued about. The road notes went to his son, and from his son to a county historical file, and there are 11 of them between 1948 and 1960, and 34 in 1961 alone, and 9 in 1963. And 1 on the 7th of January, 1964. And then nothing about the church ever again, though the book runs to 1973 and is mostly about rain and prices. I have thought about how much it cost that man to write 9 words on the 20th of December, 1963, and then never write another one on the subject for 10 more years. We put that stone back the way it was. He was not a man given to language. That is a whole night in 9 words. Corinne Slavin, the girl with the 2 goats, who got slapped for it in 1961 and did not tell it again for 17 years, married a man from Ohio and had 4 children, and worked 31 years for a school district there. She died in 2019. She talked about it exactly twice on the record, once at her mother's kitchen table with a graduate student's recorder running in 1978, and once, briefly, on the telephone in 2011 to a person doing a local history project who asked her what she remembered about the church. She said she remembered that they mowed it, and that there were bees in the wall on the south side, and that her grandmother sat in the 3rd pew on the right. Then she said, "And I remember a man counting the stones." The interviewer asked if she had ever been afraid of it, later, as an adult. And Corinne Slavin, 60 years old, in a house in Ohio, said, "No, he was not after me. He asked me a question, and I answered it right, and he let me be. He was after somebody that had something to lose." I do not know that she meant anything by that. I think she probably meant that a child has nothing. But I have never been able to read it that way, because of what came at Renner and what came at Faircloth, and because of a line in Verba Lee Hackworth's rules that I gave you 6 hours of story ago and have not touched since. It will use who you loved most, for that is the shortest way in, and the more you grieve, the shorter the way. That is not a monster that hunts the weak. That is a monster that hunts the times attached. And there is something in that which I find true in a way that has nothing to do with hollows or thin ground or stone with numbers cut in the underside, because it is exactly, precisely how grief works. It goes for the specific. It does not come at you with a general sadness. It comes at you with 4 notes of a hymn and a sentence about coming home cold from the church, and a small habit you had forgotten you knew about somebody, and it comes at the hour after dark, and it comes to the door, and it says the thing they used to say, and it says, "It times whole," in a way they never did, because the version of them you have now is a version you finished yourself. I am not going to tell you that is what this case is about. I do not think a story has to be about something, but I have read this man's notebook a great many times, and I have noticed that he never once, in 112 pages, writes that he wanted his wife back. What he writes is, "I felt like a man being let." Estill Ratliff, the 6-year-old who told a thing in the dark that there were 4 in the house and not 5 because his daddy was at the mine till Thursday, grew up in that hollow and left it at 18 and worked heavy equipment in 3 states. Marlon Pruitt tracked him down in the 1980s and asked him about it. He remembered none of it. Nothing. Not the window, not the question, not his mother coming in. He said the first he ever heard of it was his mother telling it at a funeral when he was in his 20s. And he said, and I like him for this, "If it happened to me, I would like to have got to keep it." He is, as far as I can determine, still living. Marlon Pruitt never finished the dissertation. He collected 41 interviews in that county in the summer of 1978 and got a letter from an old preacher in Ohio in December telling him, please, not to write again. And he did not write again, and he left the program in 1980 and went into public radio in the Midwest, and had a long, good career and retired. The tapes went to a university archive where they sat cataloged as hymn variants, which is what they are, mostly. 4 hours and 11 minutes of Elmer Cobble is in there. Dasha Ratliff is in there. Corinne Slavin's voice from the doorway of her mother's kitchen, saying, "Times tell him about the counting man," is in there. Pruitt was asked, late in his life, why he stopped. He said he stopped because a 78-year-old man who owed him nothing had written him a one-page letter that answered every question honestly and then asked him, plainly, to leave it alone. And he said that in 20 years of interviewing people, he had learned to tell the difference between somebody protecting a secret and somebody protecting times you, and that the letter was the second kind, and he had believed it. He was asked whether he thought there was anything to it, and Marlon Pruitt said, "I think there is a hollow in West Virginia where the winter sun is on the ground 4 hours and 40 minutes a day, and everybody who ever lived there was very careful about numbers. That is a documented fact, and it is the strangest thing I know, and I do not need it to be anything else. That is the sensible position. I want to give it its due. It has been available the whole time, and it is held by the folklorist who did more field work on this than anybody, and it may well be correct. Here is what a sensible reading of this whole case looks like, laid out fairly, and I do owe you this before I close. A remote community at the bottom of a steep hollow, dark for 2/3 of the winter day, isolated by 9-day iceovers, working dangerous jobs in mines, where the count of men who went down and the count of men who came up was the single most important number in anyone's life. Of course they counted. Of course counting became a habit, a comfort, a ritual, a piece of liturgy. Of course a blessing developed with times be counted home times in it. That is not the supernatural. That is a mining community's theology, and it is beautiful, and it is exactly what you would predict. Then, a preacher's wife dies in the February of 1961 after the road ices for 9 days, and she cannot be got out. Her husband, who is 41 years old and now has nobody, starts sleeping in the church. A stove damper thumps. Brush lines shift. Snow does what snow does in wind. A man with 3 semesters of Bible college and a great deal of unspent grief finds a 50-year-old ledger in a loft written by a predecessor who had his own catastrophe, a wife who disappeared in 1922 in a hollow with a fast cold creek, and a lot of ways for a person to be lost. And that predecessor's account gives this man's grief a shape and a vocabulary and a set of rules to perform, and performing them gets him through the worst winter of his life, and he keeps performing them for 27 more years because they worked, because they gave him something to do at 7 o'clock at night, when otherwise there was nothing. That reading accounts for nearly everything. It accounts for the pine, and the doors, and the counting, and the 2 nights in Ohio. It accounts for the numbers on the wall of a lonely old man's front room. It does not account for the tracks that Dellard Cobb saw in August of 1961 before Renner had read 1 word of Faircloth. It does not account for a 6-year-old boy correcting his arithmetic through a window to something his mother never saw. It does not account for 60 feet of trampled snow going smooth in the night. And it does not account for 311 cut in the underside of a doorstep by somebody who could not have known there would ever be a second church to count, unless they knew exactly what they were doing. But it accounts for nearly everything, and I would be lying to you if I pretended otherwise, and I have never yet ended one of these by telling you what to believe. Here is where I have landed, for whatever it is worth, and then I am going to let you go. I do not think it matters very much whether there was something standing on that flat rock, because either way, on the night of the 21st of December, 1963, the longest night of that year, 14 hours and 21 minutes of it, 4 degrees above zero, a man sat alone in a kitchen and was offered his wife back, in her voice, with the roughness in it from her last winter, and the breath in the middle of the sentence, and a January afternoon in 1958 he had forgotten he owned, and he did not open the door. He sat there and read numbers off a sheet of paper he had written out himself, because he had measured his own weakness in October and built around it, and he cried while he did it, and he did not stop, and at 7:44 in the morning there was gray in the window, and he said 4 more numbers after he knew he could quit. Whatever was or was not outside that house, That happened. That is a documented fact about a human being. And then he went out and did the other thing, which almost nobody ever does. He went and found out what the price was. And he understood that he could pay it, that there was, on that hill, an available transaction where a man could count himself into the dark and count somebody else out of it. And that it had been done once, successfully, by a preacher in 1922 who had loved his wife exactly as much. And he did not do that either. He buried an 88-year-old woman on the 7th of January, said 3 lines over her, wrote it into the church book so it would outlast him, went to Ohio, and spent the next 27 years being an unremarkable small-town pastor who barred his doors and counted the house and carried a piece of wood in his pocket and never told one living soul why. That is the whole of it. That is what he did with his life after the worst night of it. He kept a door shut, and he kept a sentence short, and he kept quiet for 27 years so that nobody would have to know what he knew. 310. Still 310. 62 years later, 310. So, here is my question for you, and then I will let you sleep. You have a blessing of your own. Everybody does. It might be a prayer, or it might be the thing you say to your kids at the door, or the last text you send at night, or the words you say over somebody at a grave, the sentence you have said so many times you no longer hear yourself saying it. Have you ever actually listened to the end of it? Do you know what the last line asks for? And if you found out that it asked for something that the thing you have been saying, kindly, for years, at the end, over the heads of the people you love, was an invitation, and that it had been answered every single time, quietly, and gone in, and been held, would you be able to stop saying it? Or would there come a night, in the cold, with somebody's hand on the box, when the person beside you says times, say the rest of it, preacher, she would want the whole of it, and you would feel that thing in your chest that Ellis Renner felt and could not name for 4 months, and finally wrote down as clearly as any man ever wrote anything. I did not feel like a man being pushed. I felt like a man being let. Tell me in the comments. Not about ghosts, about that. Tell me about a phrase in your family that nobody says anymore, and nobody remembers deciding to stop, and everybody just stopped. Every family has one. I want to read yours, and I read every single one of these, and this is the part of the night I look forward to. And if this is the kind of dark you want more of, the collection is Times What the Hollow Keeps. Times 12 cases, 12 counties, 4 states, 1879 to 1981, 9 hours end to end, told at this pace, in this voice, for exactly the hour you are in right now. The link is in the description and pinned at the top of the comments. The next case I have for you is from a mill town in North Carolina, 1947, where the second shift at a cotton mill clocked in 142 people and clocked out 142 people every night for 6 weeks, and the timekeeper kept it to himself for 30 years, because the count was right and the faces were not. Until then, bar your door, count your house. And when you say your blessing tonight, whatever it is, do me one favor. Stop 1 line short.